Welcome to Classic Trials. If you're new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we make sense of the law one bite at a time. In this series, we observe and analyze the play-by-play of some of the biggest trials that have shaped the public consciousness of the American judicial system. In this season, we're working our way through the case of California v. Erik and Lyle Menendez. Growing up in Princeton, New Jersey, and then Beverly Hills, California, these young men had everything they could ever want, or so it seemed, until one night on August 20th, 1989, they approached Jose and Kitty Menendez with newly purchased shotguns. Put on trial for murdering their own parents, they claimed self-defense, arguing they were terrorized in their own home by abusive parents until they could take no more. Which argument is more convincing? Come join and see for yourself. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Happy Monday to everybody. I hope you are doing well. I hope you had a good weekend. I hope your week is off to a good start. Sorry for being a little bit late. I had a number of things that I thought I had appropriately budgeted my time, and it didn't happen. Lately, I've been better on about being on time. Today was not one of those days. I am very, very sorry. Oh, you know what? I was like, why is my face all dark? Somehow that got turned. I blame the cats. Speaking of which, here comes one. Holmes, come here. Come here, buddy. Yeah, I know. This is why you're here. It's for the Tritos. Come on. Come say hi to everyone. Alrighty. And of course, as always, we have Indy in the Indy cam. She's being all cute and sweet. Look at you. Are we? Oh, you know what? Hang on one second here. The camera is... There we go. That's more like it. Okay. Now you can see her a little bit more closely. So before we get started, if you're a member of the channel and you joined us for the members only live stream on Friday, you are totally familiar with this about how I stumbled upon the hand signal emoji things that you can do on video on an Apple product. So, things like this. Oh my gosh. And now I'm so obsessed. I'm so obsessed. If you do this, you'll see balloons. If you do this, you might see confetti. There we go. And then of course the fireworks. I love the fireworks. Oh my God. It's so much fun. I was having way too much fun with that on Friday. I might pull those up at some point too. I just might, because it's just so much fun. So anyway, I thought I would pull that up at the very beginning. Oh, and then also if something's really bad, like we're talking about Dr. Oziel. Well, there's that. Okay, and then there's the rainstorm. That's Dr. Oziel rainstorm right there. So anyway, it is so much fun. One thing that I need to do also before we get started is to welcome our new member, Crawforder. I'm so sorry if I'm sure I mispronounced that somehow. Thank you so much for becoming a YouTube member, and welcome to Bike Club. I hope to see you on Friday at our next members only live stream. Maybe we'll get into some similar shenanigans. But yes, thank you so much for becoming a supporter of the channel. Is there a clip of Alita's reaction to the Blues yet? I have not gone back and clipped it. I think someone else said that they had clipped it and put it on their own channel. I don't know. I haven't seen it, but I meant to go back and clip it, and then also clip in the whole process of learning about this thing. But I haven't gotten to it just yet. So anyway, it was really fun. Nico Kiski, they need an objection and a gavel emoji thingy. That would be amazing. If I can, lobby to Apple and ask them for some more specific emote reactions or something, then yeah, that would be great. Can we have some personalization here? Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, it was just so much fun. Just so much fun how I stumbled upon that, and and now we know how to celebrate people's birthdays when people say that their birthday is coming up. Now I know what to do. But yeah, so we need it on this channel. I will be posting it for sure once I take a minute to do that. in the meantime, Indy is wondering how she can get another treat. Okay. Anyway, I'll take care of that in just a moment. But, yeah. So today, as always, with all of these, of course, we're probably going to get into some stuff talking about abuse and that kind of thing. So if that's hard for you at any point in time, don't feel the need to sit through the whole thing. Do what you need to do for your mental health. So fair trigger warning on all of that. And I'm sure the mods will be putting it in the chat as well. So I'll pull it onto the screen from time to time, as well as some resources for mental health helplines and things like that. So anyway, so that's that. And today we've got two witnesses. We are finishing up the testimony of Dr. Ann Tyler, who has had so much interesting stuff about childhood development, particularly about Erik Menendez. So she's been testifying only to the Erik Menendez jury. And now she is, did we start her cross-examination last week? Let me see here. Do I have that in my notes? Yes, she did. And it was, I mean, it didn't seem like anything was really sticking for the defense for the prosecution now that I think about it. But we'll be finishing that cross-examination, and then I believe a redirect as well. And then we will be getting into testimony by Dr. Ann Burgess. I know that a lot of people have been talking about her. She apparently also, after this case, she went on either after or maybe before, I don't know, at some point in her career went on to help sort of create the serial killer program for the FBI. Apparently this is what's been told to me. So I probably should double check that myself. But this is what I understand her history to be. So I'm sure her testimony is going to be absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I think that's about it. I'm very excited for today's testimony. And other than that, let's get into it, shall we? Okay, let's pull it back up on the screen. There we go.
Well, we have all participants present in regards to the case of People versus Erik Menendez, except for Ms. Morrissey, and we'll proceed without her this morning, just for now. All the jurors are present. Good morning to everybody. And we're ready to resume. We have a witness on the witness stand. Would you state your name again for the record?
Yes, my name is Ann Tyler.
All right. I'll remind you you're still under oath. You may continue your cross-examination.
Thank you. Dr. Tyler, yesterday, I believe there was some comment that you were court appointed in this case. Do you remember the commentary from Ms. Abramson when I asked you a question about your compensation?
Your Honor, I think it's improper to ask them based on my statement.
All right. Regardless of how it came out, you may ask the question.
Thank you.
More specifically.
You are affiliated with the defense on this case, correct?
That's correct.
Overall, the answer will stand.
And the funding for your fees is paid for by the state, correct?
I assume it is. They are.
And you understand that in some kinds of lawsuits, the judge will get an expert to help the court, and that would be a court expert. Do you understand that occurs?
Yes.
Okay, but that's not your status in this case, is it?
That's right.
All right, so you are affiliated, in fact, with the defense and not with the judge, correct?
That's correct.
I believe you indicated yesterday that part of what you relied upon in making your evaluation were the notes of Mrs. Menendez's therapist, Dr. Summerfield.
In part, yes.
Okay, and did you consider all of Dr. Summerfield's notes?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and were you familiar with the fact that
I'm going to object to that and offer proof.
Without what?
An offer of proof. I asked you, Coach. Or counsel finishes the question.
Are you going into the content of the notes?
yes, I'll
All right.
certainly discuss it.
Okay. All right.
Tyler, you were provided with psychological records from Mrs. Menendez from Dr. Summerfield, Dr. Cox, and Dr. Emery. Is that correct?
I was.
And you were not provided with any other records for Erik Menendez. Is that correct?
I object before the question phase.
When you say any other records, was you?
I'm sorry. You were not provided with any psychological records of Erik Menendez, correct?
Ask me.
Overall.
That's correct.
Have you ever heard of the Rosenhan study?
No, I haven't.
I believe you indicated that one of the things you found significant is that when Erik Menendez was still under the age of 2, that his parents went house hunting and left him behind. Do you remember your testimony in that regard?
Yes, I do.
And are you aware of the fact that Terry Berwalt testified that the Menendezes returned early from that trip because of Erik's behavior while they were gone?
I don't recall that they returned early. I recall that there had been a lot of concern about getting the parents home because the child was inconsolable.
Well, if Mrs. Berwalt did in fact testify that the Menendez parents returned early from the trip, would you still interpret that as being a non-nurturing thing to do?
Overall.
I don't know what Mrs. Beralt attested to on that. I know that the baby was inconsolable and had been for some time. I don't know if they returned a day early or what the situation was, but he was left for a long period of time.
If Mrs. Beralt testified that the Menendez parents returned earlier than scheduled from their trip, how would you interpret their behavior in that regard?
But they were responding to Mrs. Beralt's request.
And of course, we're not responding to the agony of their infant. Would that be your testimony?
I don't know that.
Now, are you suggesting that as a parent, it is better to take your child on a house hunting trip than to leave the child behind when the child is under the age of 2?
I'm not suggesting that.
I believe you indicated that one of the forms of psychological maltreatment visited upon Erik Menendez was that he was isolated from other people. Do you remember your testimony in that regard?
That was my testimony.
Did you consider the fact that his brother was his friend?
His brother was his friend later on in life.
What do you mean by later on in life?
When they were little, they were pitted against each other. There was quite a bit of competition. They were taught to box, and I went over that yesterday, that kind of pressure.
Were you aware of the fact that they also competed to see who could brush their teeth the fastest and get into bed at night?
Yes, I remember that.
And did you consider that to be abusive behavior on the part of the parents?
No, I did not consider that abusive.
Were you aware of the fact that in addition to his brother, that Erik Menendez was close to his cousin, Andy Cano, who's been a witness in this case?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
You're aware of the fact that Mr. Charles Wadlington was also close to Erik Menendez during his teenage years?
Overall.
Are you aware of that?
I'm aware that the coach was associated with Erik. Yes, I am.
Were you aware of Mr. Wadlington's testimony in this courtroom wherein he said that he felt at times that he was Erik Menendez's only friend?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And in spite of the presence of Lyle Menendez, Andy Cano, Charles Wadlington, and others in Erik Menendez's life, is it still your testimony that he was isolated?
Object to the form of the question, since we don't know who the others are.
Overall.
Repeat the question, please.
In spite of the fact that Erik Menendez had his older brother Lyle, his cousin Andy Cano, coach such as Charles Wadlington, and other family members such as his grandmother, his cousin Diane, and people like that in his life, is it still your testimony that he was isolated?
Yes, it is.
And the presence of his Aunt Terry living close by for most of his life, did you consider that?
Yes, I did.
And you found that in spite of that, he was still isolated. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
I believe you indicated that you could not find any photographs of the Menendez family where Mrs. Menendez was cuddling or holding Erik Menendez. Do you remember?
Mistakes the testimony.
Rephrase the question.
I believe you indicated you could not find any photographs showing physical affection between Mrs. Menendez and Erik Menendez.
I didn't see any hugging.
Did you make an independent search of the Menendez property for photographs?
No, I did not.
Were you aware of the fact that on the morning of August 21st of 1989, that the Menendez family home was turned over to the defendants by the Beverly Hills Police Department?
Yes, I am.
We are aware of the fact that at the time that the Beverly Hills Police Department completed their crime scene analysis, they did not take any family photographs with them.
Rona, I'm going to object to the form of the question as it assumes objects, not evidence. There's no evidence that there
Overall.
were photographs.
Overall.
Please restate the question.
Were you provided with copies of the Beverly Hills Police Department police reports in this case?
Yes, I was.
In addition to the police reports, did you get recovered property lists? That is, things that were taken from the home at the time that the crime scene was analyzed.
I probably did.
Okay.
Don't remember what was in them.
From your perusal of the Beverly Hills Police Department reports and the property reports, did you see anything that indicated that the Beverly Hills Police took family photographs with them when they left the house on the morning or early afternoon of the 21st of August?
I don't recall that.
Were you aware of the fact that in December of 1989, the Beverly Hills Police returned to the Menendez home and took a computer?
Yes.
Okay. And aside from that, do you have any reason to believe that Menendez family photographs are in possession of the police or the prosecution in this case?
Your Honor, I'm going to object the question is calling for speculation.
Who gave you the photographs for you to look at to see if you could find a photograph of Mrs. Menendez with her son Eric?
I looked through the family albums that were provided to me at Miss Abramson's office.
All right, so you never even went any place where, for instance, the grandmother was to look at family photographs in a family setting,
Your
correct?
Honor, I'm going to object to the form of the question. Assumes facts, not in evidence.
Sustained.
So the photographs that you were provided with were provided by Ms. Abramson, correct?
That's correct.
And this is the group of photographs from which you could not find the type described in your testimony, correct?
I didn't find any.
I believe you indicated in your testimony, and I may be misquoting you, so please correct me, that all children love their parents.
Yes.
When you say that, at what age are you speaking of? Are you talking about adult children? Are you talking about little children?
Children's parents are the only people that they know when they're born. And I think small children do love their parents and are continually wanting their approval. And I think particularly in this case, I know that Eric strove throughout his life to gain the approval of his mother and his father. Their love for him was very important to him.
Now, I believe you've indicated you've done about 10,000 hours of patient evaluation. Is that what?
Clinical hours.
Okay, and what are clinical hours?
Clinical hours is based on a 32 clinical hour week times the number of weeks in the year times the number of years that I've practiced.
Do some children hate their parents?
I haven't found children who express hatred for their parents.
And when we're speaking about children, what age group are you?
Some children don't like their parents.
Well, what about people who are, let's say, over the age of 18, who are technically children because they still have parents, but they're legally adults? Have you ever met anyone over the age of 18 who hated their parents?
I'm sure I have.
All right, so when you say all children love their parents, are you confining that to
Most children love their parents.
All right, so you're mending it to most children love their parents. Of the clinical hours that you spent interviewing the victims of child abuse, how many of those victims of child abuse have been charged with a criminal offense?
Would you repeat the question?
Of the hours that you've done doing evaluations of children who are victims of child abuse, how many of those children who are victims were also charged with a criminal offense?
None.
Is this the first time then? This case?
This is the first time? No, this is the second time.
And the other case that you were involved with where the victim of child abuse was charged with an offense, what kind of offense was that victim charged with?
Trying to get away from the
way that she says victim is like the victim. I don't know. It's just, it's very grating.
parent, and then the child was hurt and the parent was hurt.
Are you talking about physically injured?
Yes.
And was there any murder involved?
No.
You indicated that, in your opinion, and Erik Menendez loved his mother.
Yes.
Okay. Did you discuss with him whether or not he loved his mother when he shot her?
No, I didn't discuss that with him.
You indicated in your testimony that from your evaluation of his school records and some other records that Erik Menendez had some learning disabilities. Would that be a correct way of categorizing those things?
Yes.
All right. Were you aware of the grade point average that he ended up with when he completed high school?
That's not a fair assessment of anything because everybody knows that she did his homework for him.
It was good enough to get him into college. I don't recall what it was.
Okay, may I approach,
3
please,
point something.
Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm going to show you a document which Mark as the next exhibit. I think it's like
296.
All right.
What is it, one page?
It's a one-page document. This one. I'm going to show you what appears to be a printout from UCLA.
Right, I've seen this.
All right, and it appears, and I've yellowed two items. One is the computed grade point average of 3.22, and then also his SAT scores, correct?
That's correct.
All right, and his grade point average is a 3.22, and his combined SAT scores was 1,110.
That's correct.
Okay, the verbal was 510 out of 800, right?
Correct.
And in the math was 600 out of 800,
Right.
correct? All right, now, I believe you indicated in your testimony that it was your understanding that Mrs. Menendez at least had helped her son on occasion, if not more than on occasion, with his schoolwork.
That's correct.
But you had no indication, did you, that Mrs. Menendez took his test for him at high school?
No, I had no indication that she took his test for him in high school. I did have some indication that there was a test that I believe it was Mr. Menendez took for Erik. It was a Spanish test.
Would that have been a take-home test?
No,
You mean Mr. Menendez went to the high school and sat in a little chair and filled up the
no,
test?
somehow he got hold of it. I'm not sure how that happened.
Now, as far as the SAT, you're familiar with the way in which a high school student takes an SAT exam?
Yes,
You go to a big auditorium and you check in and you take
Right.
the test.
Mhm.
You had no indication that either Mr. Menendez or Mrs. Menendez took his SAT test
No.
for him?
don't have any indication of that.
I believe you indicated, this part of your testimony I don't quite recall, but you were speaking of something to do with Dr. Oziel and information that Dr. Oziel had given to Erik Menendez's parents. Do you remember your testimony in that regard?
I remember saying that I am aware of the fact that there was some sort of a signed release that Erik's parents could have information that was revealed in the therapy sessions by Erik.
Okay, may I approach, please?
Yes.
I have your exhibit 127. I'm going to show it to the witness. Is this the item that you just referred to in your testimony?
That's the item.
All right, and you were aware at the time that you saw this exhibit that this confidentiality release was to Mr. and Mrs. Menendez, referred to here as Jose and Kitty, and also to Gerald Shayla, referred to as my attorney, correct?
Correct.
You were also aware that the release was valid for a 1-month period of January 18th of 89 to February 18th of 89, correct?
Correct.
All right. Now, in your practice, is it unusual for a patient to sign a release so that you may discuss the patient with others?
Releases have very specific purposes. And when I get a patient to sign a release of information, it is always stated what the purpose is and what type of information will be released. In the case of an adolescent, I typically, the adolescent really doesn't have legal authority to sign a release, but I typically will talk about what I will reveal to the parents.
All right. Now, when you're talking, okay, so you're saying an adolescent doesn't have legal authority to sign a release, correct?
Correct.
Okay. An adult, someone 18 or older, has the authority to sign a release.
Correct.
Okay. At the time that this was signed, Erik Menendez was 18 years old.
Correct.
So he was not, in fact, an adolescent.
I consider 18-year-olds adolescents.
but the law doesn't.
I'm going to object this as argumentative.
Rule.
The law considers 18-year-olds to be adults. Do you understand
I'm gonna
that?
object the question is irrelevant.
Rule.
That's correct.
All right. So legally, Erik Menendez was entitled to enter into this particular document, correct?
That's correct.
You indicated that another
not wrong.
form of terrorization by Mrs. Menendez was the fact that she had, in your opinion, left a suicide note for her son to find.
That's correct.
And part of the information you got about that was from Dr. Summerfield's notes. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, did you ever consider the fact that Mrs. Menendez left that note not for some horrible purpose, but as a cry for help?
A cry for help from her son?
Yes.
What? I'm sorry. The adult is having the cry for help from the child. Okay. I guess. I mean, I can understand that people will do things as a cry for help, and sometimes they're inappropriate as to the different, relationships that are involved. But it just feels like the way that she asked that was like to excuse any sort of consequences that might have, or any sort of effect that might have on Erik, because it's like, oh, well, she just was doing it out of a cry for help. Like, you could be doing that and still have the effect of abusing someone. Pam.
Did you consider the fact that it was a cry for help?
Yes, I did.
And you rejected that?
No, I didn't.
All right. But I believe in your testimony, you did not categorize it as a cry for help. Rather, you categorized it as terrorizing behavior.
That's correct.
All right. And why is it terrorizing behavior and not a cry for help from Mrs. Menendez?
It was a terrorizing behavior for the child, for the adolescent, because there was nothing he could do. He couldn't be responsible for his mother's life, and it was terrorizing. It was vicious.
It was vicious on her part?
Yes, it was.
So have you rejected the notion that she was trying to get help?
From her son?
Yes.
No, I haven't rejected that notion. I'm just saying he was unable to help her.
But maybe
Two things can be true at the same time.
she didn't know that. I mean, did you consider that? Maybe she thought he could help. Maybe she thought, for instance, that if he behaved differently, that she wouldn't feel so bad.
Oh.
All right, you have to phrase it in form of a question. Briefly.
Jeez Louise. Maybe she thought that if he had behaved differently, it wouldn't be so bad. Like, that is like literally what an abuser would say. Oh my God, Pam.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Did you consider the possibility that Mrs. Menendez was trying to alter behavior in her son?
Oh,
By
Yes,
leaving
I
that
did.
note? Did you reject that idea?
No, I didn't.
Okay. But I believe your interpretation is that she was trying to do something vicious to her son, correct?
Yes.
And that is your interpretation of her conduct, correct?
Yes, it is.
A woman who you have not met.
That's correct.
You said one of the isolating
Dude,
effects
Pam.
of Mr. Menendez's behavior upon his son Erik is that there was this secret that Erik Menendez could not tell, and that secret isolated him, correct?
That's correct.
You are aware of the fact that he claims to have told his brother on 2 occasions and his cousin Andy on 3. Are you aware of that?
I'm going to object. That misstates the testimony.
What secret?
The secret about the molestation.
There were lots of secrets in that household.
All right. But when you were testifying about keeping secrets, are there other secrets you know about that Mr. Menendez told his son to keep quiet aside from the molestation?
It's the atmosphere of secrecy that I was talking about. And yes, I am aware that that particular secret was well guarded.
Well, are you aware of the fact that Erik Menendez told his cousin Andy during 3 separate conversations about what was going on with his father? At least that's what he says. Are you aware of
I'm
that?
going to object to the
Rephrase the
editorial
question.
remarks.
Are you-
Rephrase
Are
it.
you aware that allegedly Erik
I'm going to
Menendez?
object to that form of the question as also argumentative.
Are you aware of the fact that allegedly Erik Menendez told his cousin Andy on 3 separate occasions over perhaps a 3 to 5 month period the secret with his father?
I'm aware that Erik alluded to the secret.
Well, he said his father, well, I don't want to use the words, but he was pretty graphic in his description. Wouldn't you agree?
I'm going to object to the form of the question as argumentative.
Overruled. Understand the question?
Say it again.
When Erik Menendez spoke to his cousin Andy Cano, he said something about his dick. Do you remember Mr. Cano's testimony in that regard?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And you consider that to be not very specific? Is that correct?
It was not very specific. It was alluding to the nature of the abuse.
And are you aware of the fact that allegedly Erik Menendez told his brother Lyle about the alleged molestation shortly before his parents' deaths? Are you aware of that?
I am.
All right. So your testimony that he could not tell the secret is incorrect because he did tell the secret.
Yes, he did.
Objection argumentative.
Overruled. The answer will stand.
I believe you indicated in your testimony generically about child abuse victims that they don't tell unless there's some intervening event. Is that a correct statement of your testimony?
It's very typical for children not to tell.
Correct. But not all children keep it a secret, correct?
Not all children keep it a secret.
And you talked about the fact that some people never reveal until the perpetrator is dead.
That's correct.
Okay. But child abuse prosecutions are instituted against live people all the time, correct?
That's correct.
We don't try dead people, right?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the form of the question as argumentative.
Rephrase the question.
Yeah.
So the fact that the perpetrator dies is not always the triggering event for a child to reveal child molestation. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Repeat the question.
The fact that a child molester dies is not the only reason that someone would feel safe or feel
No,
comfortable.
of course not. No.
Right. During the course of your analysis of the Menendez family, did you ever consider that the reports of the relatives were exaggerated in order to aid the defendant?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the form of the question as argumentative and assume that's not evidence.
Overruled.
Did you ever consider that, ma'am?
No.
And did you ever consider that the fact that Erik Menendez had lied on several occasions would invalidate the material that he was giving you? Did you?
Again, she's talking about how he lied to the police. Oh, he lied to the police. He lied to the police. Therefore, he's a liar all the time in all the things that he ever talks about. You can't trust a single word that comes out of his mouth. If he says that his name is Erik Menendez, he's lying. Good Lord.
Did you consider that?
Yes.
And you rejected it?
Yes.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Redirect examination.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Dr. Tyler, is it the norm or is it the exception for sexually molested children to talk about it?
It is the exception.
And in this particular case, it is your understanding, is it not, that Erik was sexually molested between the age of 6 and the age of 18?
That is correct.
And do you find any evidence that he went around blabbing about it?
I did not.
Now, with respect to the allusions that he made to his cousin Andy, was it your understanding that those allusions were made some 7 years after the molestation began?
That is correct.
And was it your understanding that in his talking to his cousin Andy that he was seeking help?
Yes.
Do you recall Erik's testimony that all he wanted from Andy was some understanding of whether what was going on was normal?
Yes.
Was he seeking Andy to turn his father in?
No.
Now, with respect to his brother Lyle, is it your understanding that he told his brother for the first time at a time of crisis in August of 1989?
Yes.
And based on your examination of the entire record, was that revelation to his brother the first time he ever sought help from the outside in coping with his father's molestation?
Yes.
Objection. Leading. Assume facts, not in evidence.
Sustained. The answer is stricken.
What is your understanding about?
I was wondering when they were going to get to a leading objection because she's been leading her this whole time. I mean, it seems like Pam was just so still living in cross-examination land that she like didn't realize what was happening maybe. But now she's awake and now she's objecting.
About what the first time is when Erik ever sought help from an outside person in coping with his father's molestation.
When he told his brother Lyle.
Now, in looking over the materials that you did you read the interviews of other relatives, other friends, other neighbors than those dozens of people who came and testified in court?
Cousins.
Yes, I did.
And did you receive from me an entire set, that big, of police reports and police interviews in this case?
Yes, I did.
And did you receive copies of police interviews of other people who claimed to know the Menendez family?
Yes.
And did you see any evidence in any of those materials that indicated that the group of the dozens of witnesses who came to court had a meeting somewhere and decided to make up their testimony?
No.
Did you see any evidence from
So
any
good.
witnesses with interviews that indicated that the psychological maltreatment or the sexual maltreatment in fact didn't happen?
No.
Now, Mrs. Bozanich brought up this issue of Erik's lying. Are you aware of any information from any of those contacts with relatives or any of the testimony of the relatives that Erik lied to his relatives about the killing of his parents?
I'm not.
Do you see any evidence that he told them any stories about what he did that night or what happened?
No.
Do you see any evidence that any relative ever asked him if
No.
he had anything to do with the killing?
No.
Now, did you see any evidence that he confessed or voluntarily came up with the information that he had killed his parents?
No.
But do you see any evidence of lying to them? Of his lying to his relatives
No.
about this? Now, with respect to the police, you have read the transcripts and you have seen the transcripts of his interviews both on the night of the offense and in September of 1989, have you not?
Yes.
With respect to the night of the offense, Mrs. Bozanich asked you, did he lie to the police? What did he lie to the police about on the night of the offense?
Sustained.
Well, what has been proven in this courtroom to have been a lie from that transcript?
Sustained.
Well, Mrs. Bozanich asked you, did he lie to the police? And you said yes. What were you thinking about?
I remember he lied about going to see Batman.
Was there anything else that you were thinking of that you considered in that report a lie?
No.
Did the police in that interview, to the best of your knowledge, ever ask him if he killed his parents?
No.
Did they ever ask him if he owned a shotgun?
No.
Did they ask him if he picked up shotgun shells?
No.
Did they ask him if he had blood on his clothes or even changed his clothes?
No.
Did they ask him if he washed his hands?
No.
Where's the
Did they
leading
ask him if
objection?
there was anything in his car?
No.
Now, with respect to the statement that he gave Detective Zoller in his Aunt Terry's house on September 17th, 1989, when you answered Mrs. Bozanich's question about lying, did you have in mind anything from that statement?
No.
She's really getting on
In
a roll.
that statement, do you recall the police ever asking Erik if he was responsible for his parents' death?
No.
Or ever asking any of the questions that I just framed for you?
No.
Mrs. Bozanich asked you if there were other cases of psychological maltreatment where the parents did even worse things to the children. Are you familiar with such other cases?
Yes.
Are you familiar with really extreme cases of physical torture and physical abuse?
Yes, I
Are
am.
you familiar with cases of starvation of children?
Yes,
Are you familiar with cases where children are chained to beds and locked in rooms?
yes.
Did Erik Menendez tell you that any of those extreme things happened to him?
No, he did not.
You were asked about exaggeration. Were the incidents that he was relating to you overblown? Did they sound exaggerated?
No, they
Damn.
didn't.
Sustained, the answer is stricken.
Did you think that the information he was giving you was suspect because of the character of the anecdotes?
Yes.
You thought it was suspect?
Of the character of the anecdotes.
I mean, his information suspect.
no, of course.
And do you believe that Erik Menendez possesses sufficient mental ability to have made up stories for you had he chosen to do so?
Yes.
Let's turn to the subject of malingering. Does malingering mean basically feigning illness or making up symptoms of illness?
Yes, it does.
During the 30 hours that you interviewed Erik, did he ever tell you he was sick mentally or physically?
No,
Did he tell you he suffered from some mental illness?
no,
Did he describe for you symptoms of mental illness?
no, he didn't.
Did he tell you he was abused? I mean, did he use that word?
No, he didn't use the term abuse.
Did he say, I'm a poor abused child?
No.
In fact, Dr. Tyler, in your interviews with him, based on what he was saying, did he appear to believe that his family life was normal?
Yes, he did.
And can you recall what he said in that regard? It's offered for state of mind, Your Honor.
Overall.
Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, what did he say in regard to allusions that the interaction between himself and his parents, apart from the sexual abuse, was normal?
He thought that his interaction with his parents was the way that other kids interacted with their parents.
Now, is that a common perception among abused kids?
Yes, it is. It's very common.
And how does the psychological community understand that perception? Why is it these children feel that their life is what happens to other kids?
Overall.
This speaks to the issue of the isolation, both within the family and from outside of the family, the power and the control, and the programming and the conditioning.
Is it your understanding, based on reading all the materials, that Erik Menendez very rarely, if ever, spent significant time in other kids' houses besides his relatives?
That's correct.
Is it your understanding that he rarely, if ever, slept over at other kids' houses?
That's correct.
And when you talk about isolation, does that have anything to do with a child's ability to experience how other families operate?
That's correct.
Now, Mrs. Bazanich raised the name of 3 people who she could point to as claiming to have been close to Erik Menendez between the ages of 0 and 18. Is that a lot of close personal contact for a kid?
Overall.
No, it is not.
And what is it? What would 3 people that either think they're close to you or you think you're close to over the age of 0 to 18 mean?
I think that corroborates the fact that this child didn't have a lot of outside friends, and the ones that he had didn't know a lot about him.
And you were asked about his Aunt Terry. Based on your evaluation of Erik and of this family, are there reasons why you feel that he would not have told his Aunt Terry what her brother was doing to him?
Erik couldn't tell anybody what his father was doing to him.
Well, he told Andy at some point. My question had to do with telling an adult who was close to his father.
Well, the adults in Erik's life had control and they had power, and they ruled his world. Adults do rule the children's world.
With respect to Aunt Terry and other members of the family, did you, in reviewing the materials and listening to them testify, were you aware of how they treated Jose Menendez within that family?
He was treated as the number one son. He was the I want to say the king, the Commodore. He was treated as all powerful, all knowing, bright.
Did he appear to be respected by his sisters and the rest of the family?
Yes, I believe he did.
Did Erik ever indicate to you in your talking to him that he thought, in fact, that the family knew what was happening to him and approved? Well, it's not calling for speculation. I want to know if it's offered a state of mind by my client.
You're asking, did he say that to this
To this witness,
during the
yes.
interview?
Yes.
All right, it won't be received for the truth of the matter, just a state of mind of the defendant during the interview.
No, he did not.
Now, when an abused child reaches adolescence, is that the end of their desire to keep the secret a secret?
No.
Are there issues involving peers and how you appear to your peers that affect an adolescent's willingness to talk about embarrassing family secrets?
Yes.
Now, if you were to, do you understand that when Erik was in California and on the tennis teams, he had a lot of kids that he hung around with?
Yes.
Is it likely, given what you know about sexually molested and other abused children, that with a new group of friends, Erik would just start talking about how his father had been buggering him for years?
Oh, no.
Now, in addition to having all the police reports, did you also have all of the grand jury testimony of the prosecution witnesses?
I did.
You testified that you looked at photographs. Did I tell you what photographs to look at, Dr. Tyler?
No.
Did you look at numerous family albums in
I
my
did.
office? And did you see photographs in there of many family gatherings, Christmases, Thanksgivings, parties, those things?
Yes.
Did you see many photographs of the family on vacation and scenic photographs of pretty places?
Yes. Some.
Did you see school photographs of the children?
Yes.
And were there photographs of both parents with Erik and Lyle when Erik and Lyle were very, very young?
Yes.
And did you look at all of those photographs that you could find where Erik was quite young and with his mother?
Yes.
And did you see any photographs in which she appeared to be interacting with the child?
No.
Do you remember seeing any photographs of Jose Menendez with Lyle when Lyle was real small?
Yes.
Do you recall any of those where Mr. Menendez seems intensely focused on Lyle as a baby?
Yes, I do remember that.
Did you ever see such intense focus by Mrs. Menendez with either of the babies?
No, I did not.
Now, Mrs. Pizanich asked you about Mrs. Menendez leaving a suicide letter for her 16-year-old son as a cry for help. You recall that?
Yes, I recall
Is
that.
it your understanding that at the time Mrs. Menendez left that suicide letter, she was already in therapy?
Yes.
Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Well, at the
Yes,
time,
stricken.
Erik Menendez found the letter in the fall of 1980, in about December, I think he testified, of 1986. She was seeing a Dr. Cox, wasn't she?
Yes.
Now, why is it, without using the word vicious, why is it a maltreatment for a supposedly suicidal, allegedly suicidal mother to leave a letter saying she's about to check out for her child to find. Why is that maltreatment?
Because number one, the relationship, this is this child's mother.
What does that mean?
This child loves this mother. Number two,
Let me ask you something there. Do you think she would have left, if she wanted help, do you think she would have left a letter for a kid that she didn't think cared about her?
Judgment calls for speculation.
Sustain.
Well, you were asked by Mrs. Bozanich if she could have left the letter because she wanted his help. Remember that
yes,
question?
I remember that
Do
question.
you think a person would leave a letter seeking help from someone who just doesn't care about them?
No,
Okay, so where you're assuming, for your characterization, that Mary Louise Menendez knew that her son Eric loved her.
yes,
And, okay, so knowing that her son loves her, she leaves this letter saying, I'm leaving.
that's correct.
Is it your understanding that this letter was addressed to Eric, or was this letter addressed to Jose Menendez, based on what you know?
Judgment calls for speculation.
Sustain.
Do you have any knowledge about who the letter was addressed?
Just so you know, the picture issue is from the website. So it's not your screen, it's not my screen, it's not YouTube. This is from the original feed.
To?
No,
All right. Go on then with your analysis of why it was vicious for this mother to leave this letter, or why it was maltreatment for her to leave this letter.
well, there were several reasons. One, the relationship of the mother and the son,
Meaning the son
meaning
would-
that the son cared for the mother,
and would get upset.
very upset,
Okay.
frightened. And number two, throughout his life, he had been blamed for things that happened to his mother, and he took a lot of responsibility for those things.
And is that fair for a mother to blame a child
course
for
not.
things in her life that the child had no control over?
That's
Judgment
not,
calls for improper opinion.
Overall.
that's not fair.
She's not able to determine whether something is fair or not. Improper opinion.
And number three, at the time that this letter was left, Eric was very isolated. His brother was away, his father was away, and he was alone. And so there was no one that he could turn to. He did call his brother.
He called his brother when he found the letter. And as far as you know, the brother did offer help to the mother. Isn't
Yes,
that
that's
right?
correct.
Which she rejected.
That's correct.
And is that why you didn't consider this a cry for help, since she rejected help when offered?
That's correct.
Now, Mrs. Bozanich intimated that maybe she was doing this to change her son's behavior. Are you aware of any problematic behavior by Eric Menendez in the fall of 1986?
No?
Oh no. Okay. Well, we're getting a little bit of an interruption to the feed. Okay, come on. Spinning wheel of death. Yeah. Yeah, Mavi is I don't know, she might be like teething or something. Because she's just biting a lot of things, including like wooden objects and things like that. Mostly it's fine, but she does
Embarrassed and
occasionally bite.
humiliated Eric in public in front of other people.
Yes.
Okay, so now we're back on. But yeah, it's not uncommon for me to pick her up and for her to bite my chin and then start licking it. Oop, now what?
There seemed to be,
Okay.
based on the history of this family
There we go.
interaction, any reluctance on their part to ridicule, humiliate, or embarrass their children in public.
No.
Oh, come on. Okay.
When you do evaluations in trying to determine whether or not various forms of child abuse have occurred, is it common to have dozens upon dozens of corroborating witnesses?
Objection irrelevant.
Rephrase the question.
Okay. Have you done evaluations where there is no other witnesses to the abuse than the abused child?
Yes,
Irrelevant, Mr. Striker.
Rule, the answer will stand.
And have you, in some of those cases, based on what you're hearing from the child and your expertise, still been able to form the conclusion that the child was abused?
yes,
You've indicated that in this particular case, apart from relying on what Erik told you, and by the way, in your interviews with Erik, when you're taking information from him, are you only interested in what he's saying, or are you also interested in how he's saying it, how he looks, how difficult it is to get the information out, all of those things?
all of those things.
Now, you said that in this case you had no concerns about accepting the information that Erik gave you as true because of the corroboration.
That's correct.
Does it also depend on the way in which he gave you the information, the type of information he gave you?
That's correct. The internal consistency.
When you talk about internal consistency, you analyzed this entire family as a system, did you not?
Correct.
And did you determine patterns of behavior by both the father towards Erik and the mother towards Erik?
Yes, I did.
Did you also determine patterns, although they changed, of behavior by Lyle Menendez towards Erik Menendez?
Yes, I did.
And when you talk about Erik's information being internally consistent, does that have any relationship to these established patterns of behavior that other witnesses gave you?
Yes.
About Mr. Menendez, for example, or Mrs. Menendez?
Yes.
How did the information that Erik was giving you compare to the information that other witnesses provided?
Was consistent.
Was it consistent with these patterns?
Yes.
Mrs. Bazanich showed you that Erik had what I think are quite high scores on the SAT.
Yes.
What kind of effort, Dr. Tyler, do you think it takes for a kid with at least 3 serious learning disabilities to do that well on the SAT?
An incredible amount of effort.
And the fact that he did well on the SAT, does that demonstrate a particular trait that you saw in Erik over the course of his life?
Yes.
What
did.
is that you saw?
Erik always tried to perform well in sports, tried to do well in school, he wanted to be accepted as a Menendez man. And that was the thing that I learned from interviewing him. And it was the Menendez, I call it the Menendez myth. It was talked about by relatives that there was a very, very high performance standard and an image that had to be met and maintained. The standard met, the image maintained in order to be accepted in that family.
So from everything that you're familiar with, does it appear that Erik was a lazy kid or was he a hard worker?
It appeared that Erik worked very hard to achieve what he'd achieved.
Now, with respect to the SATs, are you aware of the fact that he also took those review courses for like a year before he took it?
I am.
Now, is it your understanding that a 3.2 was adequate to get one into the University of California system in 1989? Do you know whether it is or not?
I don't know that.
Today, that's not the case, or at least not when I was in high school going to college and trying to make it into UCLA particularly. Yeah, generally speaking, you need a 4.0 or something close to it, or even above it if you're taking all honors classes. Um, yeah, it's UCLA is a public school, but it's not necessarily easy to get into.
Do you think that Erik's talent at tennis, based on what you know from both him and other witnesses, contributed to the UC system accepting him?
Probably.
Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
You're familiar with Erik's statement that he believes that his tennis prowess and his father's connections helped get him into UC?
I'm aware of that, yes.
In all the information you received, did you ever see any information leading you to believe that after the Lewis School evaluation, Erik ever got any remedial help for the dysnoma and the dyslexia and the other thing, the writing thing?
Dysgraphia?
The dysgraphia.
No, I didn't.
Are you familiar with the testimony of one of his teachers, in fact, that she even observed he had great difficulty in the physical act of writing?
Yes.
And that's dysgraphia, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, Mrs. Bazanich suggested that by merely taking Erik to get this tutoring at the Lewis School, Mrs. Menendez was showing concern for her child's well-being, and you rejected that notion.
I did.
What, in your opinion, was Mrs. Menendez showing concern for in trying to get a few weeks of tutoring for Erik?
Objection calls for improper opinion.
Sustained.
Well, why do you reject that this was her effort that this was an expression of her concern for her child?
Well, I rejected that because this was a child who had been diagnosed with a learning disability, and he needed more than remediation. He needed to be helped on a long-term basis to work with the learning disabilities. And the fact that the school was not permitted to complete the psychological testing and examine other issues that might be impeding this child's ability to concentrate, etc. I felt that Mrs. Menendez's goal was to see that Erik became better at math.
Well, was she concerned about whether Erik was good at math or whether Erik got grades in math?
Whether
Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Based on
That's
your
true.
examination
That is
of the
speculative.
information from the school teachers and their testimony, did Mrs. Menendez ever seem to show any interest in what Erik was actually learning versus the grade he got?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Well, does that fact that based on the teacher's information that she never seemed interested in whether he learned but only the grade, is that one of the reasons you rejected the notion that she took him to this school for his benefit?
Objection improper opinion.
Sustained.
Well, you're on
Objection sustained. Let's move on.
Are you familiar with how well, first of all, are you aware that the Lewis School also was rebuffed in their efforts to refer Erik for remedial treatment or
Calls for
remedi, excuse me, can I finish? Thank you. Or remediation, as you call it.
Dude, that's
Objection sustained. The answer is stricken as hearsay.
Did you rely upon the fact in forming your opinion that Mrs. Menendez was not really interested in Erik's disabilities being addressed on the fact that the report from the Lewis School shows that they rejected all referrals for treatment?
Objection calls for hearsay.
As to the form of the question, objection sustained.
Are you familiar with what's in the Lewis School report concerning their desire to refer Erik for treatment?
yes,
And is what's contained in that report concerning the lack of referral for treatment something that you relied upon in forming your opinion, expressed to Mrs. Bazanich, that Mrs. Menendez did not take him to the Lewis School for his benefit?
yes,
And was that information that the parents refused referral?
yes,
Now, are you familiar with, or are you aware of Mrs. Menendez's behavior when she brought Erik to the Lewis School for his intake interview?
yes,
And was there anything about that behavior as reported by the head of the Lewis School that formed the basis for your opinion that she wasn't there to see that her child got help?
Yes.
And what was it about her behavior that informed your opinion?
Sustained.
Your Honor, it's not being offered.
Objection sustained. Let's move on to something else, counsel.
Are you aware of the testimony from teachers that Mrs. Menendez was very defensive and very hostile and very intimidating with them over the years?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
Was there anything in the way the teachers talked about how Mrs. Menendez would present herself at school that leads you to believe that she denied Erik educational needs?
Yes.
Calls for hearsay.
Objection sustained. The answer is stricken.
I'd like to be heard, Your Honor.
You may.
Dr. Tyler, you recall Mrs. Bazanich showed you one of the releases that Dr. Oziel said had been, it's actually a waiver of confidentiality.
Yes.
You were familiar with Dr. Oziel's testimony that that's not the only waiver of confidentiality that he had Erik sign?
Yes.
That he also had Erik sign a waiver that did not include the attorney, just the parents?
Yes.
Now, in your clinical practice, if you have an adolescent in treatment, okay, and in treatment because of what you believe is interfamily problems, is it proper clinical practice to report to the parents what that child tells you in therapy?
No.
And why not?
Because then the child has no way of ever trusting you as a clinician enough to be able to get at some of the substantive things that are going on in their lives that they need to deal with. And so you can never get established what we call a therapeutic alliance, a therapeutic relationship with a person unless they can trust you.
And are you going to get the truth from a patient who doesn't trust you?
Objection calls for speculation of proper payment.
In your,
You'll get the truth on superficial kinds of things that the adolescent can or a person can trust you with, but they will be unwilling to bare their souls, so to speak.
So really quick, I can see, however, I can see some people in 1993 having an issue with this kind of response, this line of responses. I don't know. I need to check it. Sorry. Sorry. Mr. Bites is asking me about food that's in the slow cooker. I don't know if it's ready yet. So, anyway, so I can see some people in 1993 having an issue with the idea of a psychologist kind of like maintaining this wall between the child and the parent and not telling everything to the parent. I can see people even having a problem with that today when you understand the reasoning behind it and the circumstances for it. You know, it's understandable. But it's yeah, I can see some people having an issue with it. Now, let me get some questions here that have been popping up a little bit. Okay, let me make sure I've got them all marked. Okay. Earlier, Tish asked, I've noticed a pattern how witnesses are testifying in the beginning versus in the end of their testimony. Why? Are lawyers coaching them during breaks, or is it a common effect of rethinking their testimony during cross-examination, or is it simply exhausting to testify? It is absolutely exhausting to testify. And keep in mind, this witness has been testifying over 3 parts. I think so far it's been, I mean, this is about an hour. The first 2 installments were what, like 3 hours each? So like 7 hours of testimony for this one witness. That's a lot. That's a lot. And a lot to be, well, I mean, even when you are, you know, under direct examination, which is a friendly type of witness testimony or witness examination, having it done by Leslie is maybe a bit more stressful because she's kind of this intense personality. And this is clearly someone who is a very like caring, kind of soft, not, I don't know about soft spoken, but she's not exactly an aggressive type of personality, right? So it may be a little bit jarring to her to be questioned by Leslie, and then cross-examination, of course, where a lot of the questions were just downright bizarre if you think about it from the perspective of like it sounded a lot of the questions were they definitely came across, at least to me anyway, as like abuse apologist kind of questions. Which prosecution doesn't need to go there for this case. They don't need to go down that rabbit hole. They really don't, but they chose to. And it's like, okay, all right, I guess that's where we're going. So it could very well be that she's just exhausted. It could be that she's, having to sort of think back and remember other testimony and whatnot. It could also be, the fact that the line of questioning has kind of bounced around a bit, even within the cross-examination and within the direct examination and within the redirect. Like this has all been, it's not exactly a linear kind of conversation necessarily. So that can also be exhausting for someone. So it's yeah, I don't think, I mean, typically a witness is not supposed to be coached by an attorney, during breaks, during recesses. However, I mean, here we don't have the same sort of rules for witnesses. They're all allowed to like watch all the testimony throughout trial, even while they're on the hook to come in themselves, which is just wild to me. But that's the case here. So, but typically I would say, a witness can't be coached in between their sessions. Just because, how is this at all appropriate to redirect? So, she is going into areas that have kind of been touched upon on cross-examination. That's how it's okay. Even if it wasn't a specific area that they went into in cross-examination, if on cross, the prosecution goes into a line of questioning that kind of calls into question this like lateral sort of area of testimony that she did before, and on redirect, you can come in and go into another area that sort of contextualizes some of the stuff that they went into on cross-examination. It's about providing context. It's about rounding out the corners and smoothing out the edges that have kind of shown up on cross-examination. So you are able to have some flexibility of like how far you can go. You just can't get into like an absolutely brand new area of testimony that wasn't at all triggered by anything that came up. Debbie Faison Cook, question: when the judge says as to the form of the question, does that mean rephrase the question? He's hinting. He's giving a hint to the attorney that is asking questions, because especially where there are multiple objections, he'll specify which one is sustained and which one is overruled. But sometimes where I think the one that you're referring to was a hearsay objection. I think it was a single objection, and he says sustained as to the form of the question. That basically means the way that you asked it was improper, not necessarily the line of information that you're trying to, or the information that you're trying to extract. Like, right, like improper information would be if you ask a question that is asking for this person to speculate, to speculate outside the scope of their expertise for an expert witness, or for any lay witness just to speculate at all, just to give any kind of an opinion. That's improper testimony. So that's, that's going to draw an objection most likely, and that'll be sustained. But, when he says it's sustained as to the form of the question, like you said, it's basically the judge saying, you can have another stab at this if you want to just rephrase the question, if you want to ask it in a different way, maybe lay some foundation, maybe, take another route. There is an avenue for you to potentially get this information in. So that's basically that. All right, so we are almost finished with this portion of the testimony. So let's finish up.
You were talking about getting releases from adolescent patients. Is that a release so that you can tell their parents what's going on in their therapy?
No, that is not a release.
Do you do that? Do you get releases from adolescents so you can then go and tell their parents what's going on?
No, I do not. I discuss the confidentiality issues at the very beginning with the parents and with the child, so that the parents have an understanding of that if there's to be therapy done, the child must trust that he can talk about issues that are sacred to him.
And the parents must understand they're not going to be told.
That's correct.
Once again, Dr.
Now,
Azil doing
now
something
do
shady.
you in your practice keep parents apprised that progress is being made? Or that there isn't progress being made?
Yes, and that's the initial interview also, is that we have an understanding of how treatment is to progress and what is the parent's expectation on this. I also have to talk about the two types of confidentiality that are not, that cannot be kept secret. And one, of course, is if someone is abusing a child, and the other is if someone is going to harm self or others.
Now, with respect to what you get, do you ever seek permission from your adolescent patients to tell their parents the secrets that they're telling you?
Do I ever seek the adolescent's permission to tell
these secrets, that they're telling you?
If it's something, and this is decided at the beginning, at the front, that the initial interview with the child and the parents, that if it is something that I feel that the child needs to discuss with the parents or problem solve with the parents, that I will never do this without the child's permission.
Okay. I have nothing further on.
Any recross?
Just one question. Assuming you're going to be finished with the Menendez case in approximately 1 minute, what is the total amount of compensation that you're going to receive?
Compensation, there it is.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to that. The question's been asked and answered.
Overall.
I don't know. I've kept my hours, but I don't know. I haven't figured out the number of hours I've been here.
Would it be in excess of $100,000?
Oh, goodness, no.
Well, how much are you expecting to receive in this case?
Your Honor, asked and answered.
Overall.
I have no idea. This is I'm not getting paid very much. I would make more money if I stayed home.
All right, thank you.
Anything else?
Yes, on that subject, did you agree to cut your usual rate for expert consultation in this case?
In less than half.
I don't know that that's helpful to the defense, to be honest. I don't know that I like that question. I feel like Leslie should have just left it where it was, because the answer that she gave before was good, where she was like, actually, I'd be paid more if I stayed home. That's great. But now if she's saying now that she agreed to cut her fee in half, I mean, unless there's a follow-up question to clarify what that means, it could leave the impression that she did so because she had some kind of a bias, or she had some kind of, you know what I mean? Like, I would have much rather that she had just given the default, whatever pay it is for the, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. I don't know that I like it.
And do you make more money in your clinical practice than you're making being a witness in this case?
Yes, and I sleep better. Nothing further.
All right, we'll be in recess until 11 o'clock, ladies and gentlemen. Don't discuss this matter with.
Okay, so that is the first part. That's the end of Dr. Ann Tyler. One question here: why do they always ask that? I know what they're implying, but it doesn't make sense. Of course, an expert gets paid. It's just the routine question that has to be asked of every single expert is how much have they purchased your testimony for? Which is just, I mean, it's very, lame, but it happens. I couldn't help it. I'm sorry. So I mean, most people I think understand, of course, that an expert is not going to come in for nothing, right? Like, they're not going to spend all this time on a case when they could have been using that time to work and make money and whatnot. It's just, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting, but it's just the question that gets asked every time. Tish wants to know, but does it help the prosecution, or did Pam ask that over and over again because she wanted the jury to know that she cut the price? I don't think she wanted the jury to know that she cut the price. That was Leslie that offered that. She didn't have to ask about that to introduce that to the jury. I think Pam legitimately didn't know how much she's being paid, and didn't know that she is not getting paid that much. Didn't know that I think she assumed that she was getting paid over $100,000, or that she has calculated that she, is getting that much money. $100,000 today is a lot of money. It is a lot of money. However, I mean, especially for like, to make that on one case, like, whew, that'd be nice. But uh today it means less than in 1993. Remember, what was the price of gas in 1993? It was certainly under $2, right? $2 a gallon. I remember around 2001 or something was like when it had like hit over $2 and people were like losing their minds. It was definitely a lot cheaper back then. So, just kind of like put that on par with like what $100,000 means in those days. So the fact that she was like, heck no, it tells me that Pam did not know the answer to that question, which is a huge gamble to run, to have that be your very last question, the one where you try to stick the landing. It's definitely a risk. It's not one that I would want to make, but she really likes that question of, like, how much are you being paid? Um, anyway, it's generally not advised to ask a question to which you don't know the answer on a cross examination or on a recross, or, really in any kind of a case, really. Okay, let's continue on to the next portion of today's live stream. Yeah, okay. Let me remove this, and I will add this one. Okay, here we go. Now we are moving on to Dr. Ann Burgess.
But we're now ready to resume, and we have both juries back in court, and the defense may call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Ann Burgess.
Please raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before the court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Please take the stand and state your name for the record.
Ann Wolbert Burgess.
Could you spell your full name, please?
ANNWOLBERT BURGESS.
Already she seems like a very, very like kind and warm person. And all she has done is sat down and spelled her name out.
And do you have a professional title?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
I am a clinical specialist in psychiatric mental health nursing.
And you have a doctorate, do you not?
Yes, I do.
Degree. And what is your doctor? You're a doctor of what?
I'm a doctor of nursing science.
So you're a doctor of nursing.
Yes.
And is your particular specialty psychiatric nursing?
Yes, it is.
And how long have you been, when did you receive your doctorate?
In 1966.
Now, what is your current profession?
I am a professor of psychiatric mental health nursing at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And what are your other, if there are other, professional activities?
My other professional activities, I have a clinical practice.
In what?
In both child and adult persons in psychotherapy.
Okay. And what licenses do you hold in order to be a psychotherapist?
I am certified as a clinical specialist in psychiatric mental health nursing, and that is by the American Nurses Association.
And do you have any do you need a state license for that?
Yes, I do.
And what states do you have licenses in?
I'm licensed in both Massachusetts and Pennsylvania.
And what state do you reside in?
I reside in Massachusetts.
And you teach in Pennsylvania?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, we were saying you have a clinical practice, and you're a professor, and you have a clinical practice as well. What other professional activities do you regularly engage in?
I also engage in research, clinical research,
In what fields are you engaged in clinical research?
in the fields of victim trauma, child sexual abuse, child pornography, crime scene analysis.
And are there any other professional activities that you have time for?
I also belong to professional organizations. I also hold positions with government agencies.
What agencies do you hold positions with?
I am chair for a study section at National Institutes of Health, the AIDS and Related Research Study Section 6.
Okay. Now, would you tell us about your educational background?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree from Boston University, and my registered nurse at that time. I have a Master of Science degree from the University of Maryland, and I have a Doctor of Nursing Science from Boston University.
And after, did you complete your education all in one block and then start your professional work, or did you intersperse it?
I pretty much completed it in one block.
And would you tell us what the early years of your professional career were? What did you do and what were you involved with?
In my early, I always held an academic position, and I've always combined my academic position with a private practice. And because I'm an academe, I do research, and I write, I publish, and I attend professional conferences and serve on professional boards.
What was your first academic appointment?
My first academic appointment was at Boston College School of Nursing in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts.
And what was your position there?
My position there was first associate professor, and then I was promoted to professor. And I also had some administrative positions. I was chair of the community health program in nursing, and later I was chair of the graduate program in nursing.
And what was your next academic position?
My next academic position was at Boston University, and I went there 1980 as director of nursing research.
Now, Boston University is a different institution than Boston College, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
One is BC and one is BU.
That's right.
Okay. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you were what at Boston University?
I was both director of nursing research, and then I was interim dean of the School of Nursing at Boston University.
And what was your next?
So like minor credentials, basically. Like, it's wild. And this is her CV, like leading up to the Menendez trial. What is it after this trial?
Next academic either distinction or position?
In 1983, I accepted a position at the University of Pennsylvania as the Van American Professor of Psychiatric Mental Health Nursing.
And you said currently you are the head of the Psychiatric Mental Health Nursing Division at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing?
Yes, I am chair of the division.
What do, and I take it in that you are educating, teaching people to become psychiatric nurses?
Yes, I'm responsible for that area of nursing.
Now, describe for the juries, if you would, what is it a psychiatric nurse does?
A psychiatric nurse diagnoses and treats actual and potential mental health problems. Primarily is concerned with the care of persons who have mental problems, mental disorders.
Now, that's a different kind of track, isn't it, to get to be a therapist, for example, than just becoming a psychologist and doing it that way?
Yes, it is.
What is the main distinction in the training between being someone with a bachelor's degree in nursing and a specialty in psychiatric nursing versus someone who has a bachelor's degree in psychology and just graduate degrees in psychology?
Well, in nursing, we have our own body of knowledge, and at the undergraduate level, we prepare students to be what we call general practitioners so that they can practice in a general way. in a variety
in
of
all
settings.
nursing.
And that's all nursing. At the master's level is when we begin to specialize, and that is when a student would select a particular area. There are generally about 5 or 6 major areas in nursing. And then at the doctoral level is where the research is done, and it pretty much follows the fairly standard PhD, Doctor of Nursing Science program of studies. But the focus, of course, would be in nursing in our own field.
Have any of you watched For All Mankind on Apple TV Plus? I listened to her. I know there's been a lot in the chat right now about her accent and where does she come from? To me, she sounds like exactly like what's her name? Margot. Margot, who ends up becoming like the director of NASA, and she had like worked her way up. She sounds like exactly like her, in my opinion. It's like if they did a legit movie about the Menendez brothers, and hopefully they would actually be historically accurate about it. I feel like she could play Dr. Ann Burgess here. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with her, but I mean, to me, this sounds like a Texas accent. But I could be wrong about that. I think it's Texas. Anyway, it's just, I know it's a side conversation, not relevant to the testimony at all. Anyway, I felt like I needed to say it.
Now, someone with that kind of a background who obtains a doctorate in psychiatric nursing, do they have medical information, medical training that ordinary psychologists would not ordinarily have?
Yes, we have a strong biomedical background that our students must be able to master for a beginning level practice.
Now, you've indicated you've always held an academic position and you've always been involved in research. Is
Yes,
that correct?
I have.
Could you describe for the juries what your first focus of research was?
My first focus of research was when I was at Boston College, and this actually followed my joining with several other professors on campus to have an interdisciplinary seminar for our graduate students in the healthcare system. And at the close of that semester's seminar, a colleague from that seminar, a sociologist, Linda Holmstrom, approached me.
Hang on. The actress that I'm talking about so she plays Margot Madison on the show. It's Ren Schmidt is her name, and she's actually from South Carolina. So sorry guys, my apologies. I'm not always the best at like detecting specifically where people come from. But yes, maybe that's more of a South Carolina accent. I'm not sure. Definitely a Southern one for sure. Is what I'm registering. Anyway, I love it. I absolutely love it. I'll stop interrupting now.
To talk about a research project that she wanted to undertake. And this was actually the first time that I began a course of research, and it was on the study of rape victims.
Now, what year was it that you started this research on rape victims?
It was a 1-year study between 1972 and 1973.
Now, are you familiar, Dr. Burgess, with the term rape trauma syndrome?
Yes, I am.
And where did that term come from?
That was a term that Linda Holmstrom and I coined in one of our first major publications from our sample, and that was actually the title of a paper that was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 1974.
And has that concept, that syndrome that you and Linda Holmstrom defined, become accepted throughout both the law enforcement and psychological and psychiatric community?
Yes, it has been accepted by those communities.
Now, could you describe for us the areas of your research following this first project on rape victims?
The area of research then expanded from the adult victims to child and adolescent victims of sexual victimization.
And for how many years were you engaged in research dealing with sexual victimization of children?
This was for the first 4 or 5 years, that was the primary area. It did expand into other areas, but that was the primary area.
And did you, as a consequence of your research and writing in this area, gain recognition as nationwide as an expert in child sexual abuse?
Yes, I did.
And as a result of that, were you contacted at some point by the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Yes, I was.
And when were you contacted by the FBI?
I believe it was 1976, 77, about that time period, possibly even 75.
And what was the basis, what was the reason for the contact by the FBI? Why did they contact you?
Condition calls for speculation.
Overall.
At that particular time, the FBI Academy, that's based in Quantico, had the responsibility of training both their own agents, but also law enforcement. And they had received, I guess, a mandate that they needed to train in the area of rape and sexual assault.
Train in the area of rape and sexual assault in what sense? For what purpose?
In terms of the investigative aspect, because that's their specialty, but they needed information on the victim for them to be able to develop their training materials.
They needed information about victims of rape and sexual assault
Correct.
in order to be able to investigate those kinds of cases.
That's correct.
And were you at that time recognized as an expert in victimology?
At that time, yes. We were certainly publishing in the area. I'm not sure at that particular time because Linda Holmstrom and I were getting our publications out, and they do need a period of time in the journals to gain acceptance.
Are you now recognized as an expert in victimology?
Yes.
What is victimology?
Victimology is a study of the victim in which all aspects, as best research is able to do, brings to bear on that particular topic.
For what purpose? Why do you want to know about victims?
The victims tell an important or a very key part of any investigation. If you're doing it from the investigative standpoint, and certainly from a clinical standpoint, they need treatment. But from an investigation, that is your primary source very often of information. And so that is one of their first starting points in law enforcement.
And what is it that victimology, that the study of victims is attempting to do for law enforcement? What is the kind of information you're trying to give law enforcement about victims that can aid law enforcement in their investigation of these kinds of crimes?
Well, the task of law enforcement is to find a suspect. It's suspect apprehension is what law enforcement is primarily engaged in. And once that phase is completed, then that generally starts the criminal justice system process.
Okay. But what is it about victimology that does it assist in suspect apprehension? Does it also assist in presenting the case and knowing how to deal with victims and knowing how to assess their information, that kind of thing?
Oh, yes. And what the training is how to interview, how to take information, how to get the very best that you can from a victim. And of course, that is what we would try to help them with. They need to understand the state that the victim is in at the time they see the victim and know how to perhaps reduce some stress to get information from the victim.
Is there also, based on your research and others in the field, are there also guidelines for interviewing victims in these kinds of cases so that you're not suggesting things to them, so that you're getting as accurate and credible information as you can?
Absolutely. Yes.
Are there also, based on your research and others' research, indicia that you're training law enforcement in of when people who claim to be victims of these crimes are indeed likely to be telling the truth versus perhaps not?
Yes, all of those things, yes.
And are all of those things that you have studied and researched and are considered an expert in?
Yes.
Okay, so after this contact by the FBI, did you begin an affiliation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Yes, the training division at the Academy in Quantico.
And what was it that you were doing for them?
Well, one of the things, it was a joint venture actually in terms of helping them with what is called the data reduction. They were doing interviews with criminals that they would be interviewing and trying to amass a certain amount of information. And that's precisely what I and some colleagues began to assist them in. And so that was really the research part and consultation.
Okay, so you were interviewing what's also known as perpetrators, is that correct?
The agents were interviewing them. We were assisting them with the data analysis part.
Okay, just to break that down, agents are interviewing perpetrators of sex crimes?
Some were sex crimes, of sex crimes, yes, at the time.
I mean, with regard to your involvement, and at that time, was it, and you were trying to assess the data that the agents were receiving from the perpetrators?
Well, essentially, we devised a protocol that the agents then did two parts of an interview. They would do their regular interview, and then they would complete the protocol based on not only the interview, but they are very thorough in their work, and they do not just, they would look at all kinds of records to corroborate kinds of things. And so that's what we helped them with to the protocol.
What was the purpose of the protocol? What was the type of information that was being sought from the perpetrators?
Well, we were looking for patterns and hopefully for some predictors that would then assist law enforcement in their suspect apprehension. That's always the goal, if you will, of law enforcement.
So you were trying to find similar patterns among perpetrators of these kinds of crimes to assist law enforcement in apprehending other perpetrators?
Yes.
And other crimes?
Yes. Well, they would take the sample that we had, and then you would look at that from a statistical standpoint to see if that had application to other crimes.
And did there appear to be patterns of behavior, patterns of perhaps even psychological makeup among sex crime offenders?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled. You can ask that question.
Yes, that is essentially true, yes.
Now, was this the only assistance you provided to the FBI with respect to developing protocols and patterns for apprehending suspects, or were there some other areas you got involved in with them as well?
Oh, yes, we got involved with, over the past 15 years, we've been involved in a number of studies, and some of which have been funded by the Department of Justice that have looked at other things.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the
That have looked at other aspects
other aspects of what?
of investigative work.
So you're still involved with the FBI, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Now, for the past 10 years, have you been involved in a
So cool.
particular set of studies or projects with the FBI?
Yes, I have.
And what is that study called, or what is it about?
The overall study is called the Crime Classification Project, of which there are a number of parts to that.
Okay, what part have you been affiliated with?
The part that originally started was what was called the crime scene analysis. And that is part of what's called the profiling process, which is
Okay, a profiling process of whom?
profiling process of a unnamed subject.
The FBI was trying to develop profiles in order to help them apprehend unknown suspects.
Profile indicators, right? Not profiles in terms of any identified person, but just characteristics, if you will, of unknown subjects.
And one of the ways they were trying to develop that was by analyzing crime scenes.
That is correct.
Okay, 1 second, guys. I'm going to take a really quick, like 2-minute break just to check in on something, and then I'll be right back. So just talk amongst yourselves. Maybe put in some more fun facts about Dr. Burgess in the chat, and then I'll be back very, very quickly. So. Okay. Yeah, I I had to check in on a slow cooker to see if something was ready, and it is, and it smells really good. And actually Mr. Bites already had some and he said it was very good. So, oh, maybe this good. Ah, fireworks. Okay. Anyway, back to back to the testimony. I'll just press play.
And what was your involvement in the crime scene analysis portion of the crime classification project?
My role was in the analysis of the information that they brought from the interviews that they had with the convicted offenders.
But that's, all right, but what involvement did you have in the process of examining crime scenes in order to make determinations about potential perpetrators?
Okay. Well, one of the things was to actually look at how they examine crime scenes, the types of records, photographs, information forensics, the massive amount of information that they took, and then how they looked at that and essentially how they thought their process of thinking in coming to an investigative decision, if you will, about the material that they had seen.
And were you involved with the FBI agents in refining and defining the methods by which, or the ways in which they would classify crime scenes in order to work out these characteristics of potential offenders?
Yes, I was.
And was one of the areas in which the FBI was classifying crime scenes the area of homicides where people are killed?
That is, yes, it was.
And how long has this particular project been going on?
That project began in 1980 with a funded study.
And were you were involved with it then, is that correct?
I was principal investigator on that project.
And over the course of work on that project, did the FBI and those of you who were consulting with this project come up with classifications of homicides by crime scene?
Yes.
And how many different classifications of homicides by crime scene are there?
Basically three.
Excuse me, three?
Three.
And what are the three classifications?
One is the organized, one is the disorganized, and there is a third category that has been added that's called a mixed crime scene.
Now, are there 32 kinds of homicide according to the FBI guidelines?
This is one, yes. The most recent classification of homicide identifies, I think it's 32 categories within the homicide section.
Okay. And is there a category for what's known as domestic homicide?
Yes, there is.
And what does domestic homicide mean?
Domestic homicide means where there is some type of relationship between the victim and the offender. Generally must be either a significant partner or a family member.
And are there guidelines for, well, strike that. In analyzing a crime scene, are there indicia or indicators, things that under this method of crime scene analysis point to domestic homicide versus some other kind?
Yes, there are.
And I take it there are things that point to non-domestic homicide as well.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, Dr. Burgess, were you asked to, in effect, apply these guidelines from this FBI crime classification methodology to the crime scene in this case?
Yes, I was.
And what information or objects were you asked to review in order to make that kind of analysis?
The information included all of the crime scene photographs, the forensic reports, the medical examiner's reports, the police reports, anything that pertained to information relating to the crime scene.
Did you also read the testimony of the coroner, medical examiner in this trial?
Yes, I did.
Did you read the testimony of the investigating officer, Detective Zoller?
Yes, I did.
And you said you looked at all the crime scene photographs?
Yes, I did.
Did you also look at the autopsy photographs?
Yes, I did.
And based on your review of that material, were you able to make some classifications of this crime scene?
Yes, I did.
First of all, with respect to type of homicide, were there indicators here that pointed to a particular type of the 32 types under the FBI classification system?
Yes.
And what particular type of homicide did the crime scene analysis indicate?
A domestic killing.
And why did the analysis of the crime scene indicate a domestic killing?
There was no forced entry. There was no movement. The bodies were not touched. They were left as what is called the death scene was the same as the crime scene. They were not moved. There was no evidence of material being taken from the house. No theft, right, no theft. Not even the doors to the house, there was no break-in there, and there appeared to be no break-in through gates.
So that tends to indicate what?
That tends to indicate that there is a known relationship, that these were not strangers.
Well, does it tend to show that it's a family member or a close relationship, or could it also show an acquaintance or a?
Well, initially you would look at all of those factors, but essentially that there was no break-in, and the bodies were essentially certainly suggested that it was domestic rather than they had expected, had let somebody in.
Well, if they had let somebody in, they certainly weren't shot right upon that point. Is that what you're saying? That they're in an interior room of the house?
Yes, they were.
Now, in addition to making a determination in crime scene analysis of the type of homicide, I believe you started to tell us before that there are three basic classifications for the crime scene itself.
That is correct.
And you said they were, number one was disorganized.
That is correct.
And number two was organized.
That is correct.
And number three was mixed.
Right. They should be the other way. It should be mixed, should be in the middle.
Okay, disorganized, mixed, and organized. I'll do it that way. Okay, now, what is the purpose, if you will, of classifying a crime scene as either organized or disorganized?
It speaks to the amount of planning that can be determined from just looking at the crime scene.
And why would the FBI or any law enforcement agency, for example, what investigative purpose does it serve to analyze a crime scene to see if there has been planning or no planning?
Well, it's generally going to alert or tell the investigating officer where to focus their investigation, what type of person, what relationship, et cetera, to begin to look for.
And are there certain crime scenes that tell a great deal about the actual person, if not the actual identity, personality characteristics of the perpetrator?
Yes, in fact, that's essentially what the FBI describe it as, is that they try to read the personality, if you will, of what has happened in the crime scene.
Was the earliest part of this study focusing on serial sexual killings?
Yes, it was.
And was it characteristic of many of those killings that there were sort of repetitive, since they were serial killings, there's more than one, but I mean sort of ritualistic features?
Yes, there was.
So with respect to those kinds of crime scenes, can a great deal be learned from the psychology, if you will, of the perpetrator?
Oh, yes. And don't forget, the other part of the study was they had done the interviews with these persons.
With people who had been convicted of such crimes.
Yes, and they talked about their crime. So it wasn't just the crime scene, but it was able to get the offenders did talk.
Just like what happened in Mindhunters.
length.
And so as a result of this study, did the FBI develop a way of looking at a crime scene to know when certain kinds of planning is going on as reflected by what they wind up with?
Yes.
Now, with respect to a disorganized crime scene, what does that say? How does that fit into the notion of planning or no planning?
Disorganization generally implies low amount of planning,
If any?
if any, correct.
And I take it an organized crime scene
Shows very few clues, very elaborate planning, certainly to the point where there's no apprehension of a suspect.
And when you talk about planning, is it viewed from a perspective of just whether you could tell how much thinking went in, or is it viewed from the perspective of, if you will, detection?
It is from detection as a major part.
Now, would you explain just what that means? I mean,
How to the detection aspect of a suspect. This is what was looked at in terms of the study of how quickly the person was apprehended. More likely than not on the disorganized side that the suspect was almost immediately apprehended. And see, that's the way the statistics came in. This is by placing these into the crime scene patterns, and then to see how fast there was suspect apprehension.
so but my question is, does the planning component have to do with planning to avoid detection?
Oh, yes. That's the intent of the offender, to avoid detection, yes.
Okay, I mean, that's the kind of planning that they're looking at.
Yes.
It's not like planning to, inflict a particular injury or planning to leave a pink scarf under a radiator. It's planning to avoid detection that they're focused on. Is that right?
Yes.
So if you find a disorganized crime scene, then what you're finding is low or no amount of planning to avoid detection. Would that be a fair statement?
Generally, yes. Mm-hmm.
And in applying these guidelines and analytical methods to the crime scene here, did you reach a conclusion about what kind of crime scene this was?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
And I will preface it that there are generally there may be indicators of both organized and disorganized, but generally in this crime scene, I saw more evidence of disorganization.
And did that indicate to you a lack of planning to avoid detection?
Yes.
Objection, improper.
Objection sustained. The answer is struck.
Does it appear to be a disorganized crime scene because you cannot see any significant evidence of planning to avoid detection?
Yes.
Now, what was, under the FBI's criteria, what was disorganized about this crime scene?
Okay. Location, choice of what? Of
Why don't
weapon.
you give me a list and I'll ask you to do it.
Okay.
Location.
Location, choice of weapon,
Mm-hmm.
injuries to victims,
Mm-hmm.
emotionality, indicators of emotionality,
Interesting.
where the actual injuries were.
Okay. Is there also a concept that's applied in crime scene analysis called staging or lack of staging?
Yes, there is.
Is that part of the analysis of whether it's a disorganized crime scene, or is that another type of indicator?
No, it is an indicator that is also considered staging, yes.
And did you find staging or lack of staging in your analysis of this crime scene?
Lack of staging.
And is that an indicator of disorganized crime scene?
Yes, it is.
Interesting.
Okay, so we've got 6 factors now. Are there any others that you determined pointing to a disorganized crime scene?
No, no.
Now, was there a factor pointing towards organized that showed some pre-thought?
Yes.
And what was the organized factor?
One organized factor was that there were no shells found
Okay.
at the crime scene.
And was there any other organized factor? That you could tell just by looking at the crime
No,
scene?
that was the main factor. They
Okay. Now let's talk about each of these factors of disorganization, starting with location. What is it about the location that points to disorganized or no significant evidence of planning to avoid detection?
There was one other factor on the organized, the lack of weapon, I'm sorry. Lack of weapon and no shells.
Okay, so lack of weapons left at the scene
At the
is what
scene.
you mean.
Yes.
Okay, and we'll get to those as well. Let's start just with what is it about the location? What do you mean by location?
Okay, location is where actually the crime occurred.
And what is the location here?
Location here is interior of a home that's in a residential area, in a fairly residential area. In other words, there are other houses around, and it is inside.
Okay, and what appears to be lacking in plan for escaping detection about that site?
Well, one of the factors you have to also add the type of weapon that was used.
Okay.
I'd like to combine that to look at those two. The type of weapon it was known was a shotgun.
Now, you're familiar, are you not, based on your work with the FBI and how shotguns operate?
Yes,
You're familiar with other weapons as well, based on that work?
yes, I am.
In fact, have you been to crime scenes and actually done this analysis on site?
Yes, I have.
All right. So then we have a combination then of shotguns in a residential area being used in an interior room.
Yes.
Okay. And maybe it's obvious, but what is it about that bespeaks no significant evidence of planning to avoid detection?
Okay. Well, one of the factors is that this is a very loud type of weapon to be used, and the number of shells that were fired, there was a large number of shells fired, and so that the noise certainly was a key factor.
And when you do your crime scene analysis, the initial analysis has to do solely with what the actual scene is like. Is that right?
That's right.
But does the FBI, and do you in working with them, upgrade the analysis as more and more information comes in?
Yes, you do.
And are you aware, therefore, that in this case, both in in-court testimony and police interviews, a fairly large number of neighbors heard this?
Yes, I am aware of that.
And does that validate the initial analysis that using a shotgun in a residential neighborhood in an interior of a house is going to be heard?
Yes.
Okay, now you didn't know anything, by the way, and you haven't been given any information, have you, about the average response time of the Beverly Hills Police Department to gunshots in their little city?
No, I don't have that information.
Did you have the information that the Beverly Hills Police Department is located less than a mile from this particular crime scene?
No, I did not know that.
Okay, now you said the third factor here pointing towards or leading to the characterization as disorganized was the injuries to the victims. And what do you mean by that?
Injuries to victim is that you look at where on the body in a gun shooting case where the injuries are, and not only where they are on the body, but the number.
And why does that tell you something about organization versus, or how does that tell you something about organization versus disorganization?
Okay, the more organized type of person who shoots is going to use the minimum amount of shots to accomplish the task.
And why is that? Why is using a minimum amount, if you're more organized, preferable?
Because several reasons. One, they've thought about it, they've planned it out, they want to do it as fast as they can, if you will, and avoid detection, so to get out of the area fast.
Okay. And you said there was another?
It's the type, also the type of weapon that's chosen to accomplish the task.
Okay, when you talk about that a more organized, a more planned shooting would use fewer shot you put that in terms of getting out as fast as can. Is noise obviously also a factor?
Oh, yes, noise is a factor, and the location, that the site, if you will, of the shot to, again, accomplish the task,
So
side of the body.
in your analysis here, based on the photographs and the autopsy report and the testimony, did you determine that this was an unnecessarily large number of shots?
Objection, improper opinion.
Sustained.
Okay. Did you determine that the number of shots here bespoke a disorganized crime scene?
Yes.
And you said that there was also an aspect of disorganization based on evidence of emotionality in this crime scene. And could you tell us what that means?
Yes, that the term is sometimes used overkill, that there is more shots are fired than is necessary to accomplish the task. And this was the situation in this crime scene, that a large number, far more shots were fired than necessary.
So and that indicates that there is emotion involved?
Yes, that generally points to what's called a high degree of emotion.
Now, are there any indications based on any of the crime scene information as to what emotion might have been involved?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Your Honor, that's just a foundational question.
Well, we haven't laid a foundation for any such opinion.
All right. In the analysis that in these guidelines for analysis that have been developed by the FBI, are there criteria concerning where the wounds are inflicted on victims that, based on all of the research, indicate particular attitudes by the perpetrator towards the victim?
Yes.
And you indicated that one of the indicators here of disorganization was where the injuries were.
Yes.
Is that tied to the emotionality issue?
Yes.
Okay. And what is the research shown that the FBI has conducted about the location of injuries and the attitude or emotional state, if you will, of the perpetrator?
Yes. Well, the research looks at, for example, if one site, one particular area is focused on, that indicates a lot of, it could be anger or rage, for example, in sexual homicide. Parts of the body are focused upon that speak to the emotion the person has towards the sexual parts.
Okay, so in one of the analysis, if it appears that a particular part of the body has been singled out, such as the sexual parts of the body in sexual crimes, that bespeaks anger towards the victim?
It speaks about their focus on those particular parts. In other areas, oftentimes face, there is an enormous amount of injury to the face. It doesn't have to be a gunshot, but it can be other beating and so forth. So that the site of the injury, whether it be by hand or by gun, is important. It's called either depersonalization, as a way to read the injury part of the victim.
Okay. Now, when you said to the face, you're talking about where most of the trauma is focused on one part.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, what analysis did you come up with concerning where the injuries were on these two decedents?
My analysis that the injuries were random, if you will. They were to all parts of the body. There was not one area singled out.
Did you determine that there were even injuries to parts of the body that would not be debilitating? I mean, to parts of the body that made no difference with respect to either bringing about a fatal response or debilitating the victim?
Objection vague.
Sustained.
What conclusion, based on this analysis, could be drawn, or what could be posited, if you will, about the fact that the injuries here appeared to be random and were to all parts of the body?
Well, that would speak to a more pervasive emotion than just one emotion, such as anger or rage or what, but would speak to a wider aspect,
Such as?
such as fear.
That's really interesting.
Now, you said that there was a concept called staging,
Yes, I did.
and you indicated you found lack of staging here. Now, what is it that you saw or learned about this crime scene that led you to that conclusion? First of all, why don't you explain for us what staging means?
Staging means that the offender has done something to the crime scene to make it look like another crime occurred, or in some way to cover up or to lead investigators into another direction.
Okay. Now, is that like affirmatively putting things or doing things to make it look like somebody unlike the offender did the crime?
Yes, things can be actually added and brought in, or things can be removed, such as in removing items, burglarizing, to make it look like that was the primary intent.
Okay. Now, you said, though, that there were no shells found here. So something, and obviously you know about shotguns, these things fly out of them and they do hit the ground, right?
Yes.
So is the removal of the shells here staging, or is that something else?
No, that wouldn't necessarily be called staging, because it is removing, it's related to the weapon and removing the weapon, but not in the sense that it's trying to make it look like another type of crime. It's quite clear what the crime was, or the killings were.
Well, it also doesn't indicate any, strike that. You indicated one example of staging would be, for example, to make it look like the place was burglarized when in fact it was a domestic crime.
That's correct.
Or to move the bodies to make it look like there was some maybe potential for ransom or something like that when it was just a domestic crime.
That's correct.
So you didn't see any evidence of that staging.
No, I did not.
Now, you aware of the fact, based on testimony and police reports, that there actually were 2 rifles in the house at the time of the shooting?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Would it be considered staging if, for example, those rifles had been loaded by the shooters and placed in that family room?
That would be one indicator, or suggest one indicator, yes.
All right, let's take our recess until 1:30, ladies and gentlemen. We'll resume at 1:30. Please don't.
And what does that bespeak
Quick
of
recess.
concerning any of these indicators of disorganization?
In terms of targeting or focusing in on a particular site, it shows that there was much more of a random aspect to the shooting. It was not clearly planned into one area.
Now, in analyzing a crime scene for planning purposes, do you look at it with a view to different stages, planning stages?
Yes.
And what are the different planning stages?
There are 3 planning stages. One is where you try to get what's called the pre-crime, before the crime.
Pre-crime planning?
Planning, pre-crime planning.
Okay,
Second would be during the crime.
okay. Now, if you talk about planning during the crime, that means taking additional action, planning additional action?
Yes, actually how it is enacted, how the crime is enacted.
Okay, so during the crime, how it's enacted bespeaks planning at that level or planning before the crime even began?
It may include both, but primarily what happens during that precise time.
Okay, and what's the third stage?
And then the third is the immediate post-crime behavior for planning.
All right, now, you have testified that there were 2 indicators of planning at some point, in the fact that no shells were found, which means somebody took the time to pick them up, and the weapons were not left behind, meaning they were removed from the scene.
That's true.
Now, do those 2 facts, shells being picked up and weapons removed, do those speak to pre-crime planning, during crime planning, or post-crime planning?
I speak to post-crime planning.
Now, there is evidence in this case that is not evidence from the crime scene concerning reloading, okay?
Yes.
It's not your role here to comment on all the evidence in this case and decide whether this was or was not a planned crime, is it?
That's true.
You're here to analyze a crime scene?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you one hypothetical question, though, based on the number of injuries inflicted and the location of the injuries and the significance of those injuries from a mortality standpoint as testified to by the coroner, okay?
Yes.
And I want to give you this hypothetical question. If hypothetically there is one reloaded shot and it is to the left side of Mrs. Menendez's face, okay?
Yes.
In your opinion, was that more evidence of overkill?
Yes, it was.
Was that shot, based on your medical background and you're reading the testimony here, necessary in any way to affect the death of Mrs. Menendez?
No, it was not necessary.
You're familiar with the coroner's testimony that she had received numerous other fatal wounds.
That is correct.
Now, is there another way of characterizing a crime scene apart from disorganized and organized? Is there a way of characterizing it in terms of risk of detection?
Yes.
And did you make that analysis with respect to this crime scene?
Yes, I did.
And how would you characterize this crime scene with respect to risk of detection?
Characterize it as high risk of detection.
Now, you've indicated, all right, why don't you tell us what the factors are that lead you to characterize this as high risk of detection? I take it to the person who did the shooting.
Okay. Well, one of the indicators of detection would be getting evidence on one's person. And given the location, type of weapon, there is a high probability that some of the blood from the close range firing of multiple shots would have in some way gotten on to the person or persons. The second is, of course, the location, the small area in which this crime occurred, and the noise from the multiple guns, and that it was in August at a time when doors would be open in terms of the noise being heard outside of that immediate area.
Now, in another respect, let's assume now you can't tell when you analyze a crime scene, I take it, strike that. In looking at this crime scene when you analyze this crime scene, you put out of your head anything you knew about who was ultimately arrested and what the rest of the facts of the case were. Is that
Yes.
correct? And could you tell just by a pure analysis of the physical evidence of the crime scene whether there was one shooter or two shooters?
No.
Now, later on, of course, you know that both Erik and Lyle were arrested, and now you know, of course, that both Erik and Lyle have testified that they were the shooters in this crime scene.
Yes.
From the perspective, then, of two people shooting in this close space with shotguns, was there an additional element of risk, not of detection, but of another kind of risk in this crime scene?
In terms of, yes, in terms of, first of all, reloading was one issue, and the second of getting the evidence on them.
I'm talking about risk in a small space with two people shooting shotguns off.
Well, the noise certainly is going to be double the noise in terms of, and at fast, rapid, if you will, shooting, that the
How
noise
about
would be very loud.
How about the risk of shooting each other?
Oh, absolutely, knowing that they're absolutely.
So does the fact that two people would be involved in shooting a large number of rounds from shotguns, loaded mainly with size 4 buckshot in a relatively small space, bespeak careful, thoughtful planning?
No, it does not.
Now, in addition to the risk of evidence such as blood or from the actual shooting, are you familiar with, you've indicated you're familiar with shotguns. You're familiar with the forensic evidence that guns produce, are you not?
Yes, I am.
You're familiar with gunshot residue testing, for example.
Yes, I am.
And firing a large number of rounds from a shotgun, does that produce a fairly large quantity of gunshot residue?
Yes, it does.
So if there is evidence that persons fired this kind of gun and there's no evidence that they wore anything protective to keep the residue off them, does that add to the high-risk nature of this crime scene?
Yes.
Now, in picking up the shells, okay, in analyzing this crime scene, when you looked at it and realized that the shooter had or shooters had picked up the shells, although that bespeaks some post-crime planning, does it increase risk of detection post-crime?
Yes, it does.
And in what way?
Because the evidence can be found. It depends where the evidence goes, where it is ultimately put.
So there is a transportation period or a need then to try to dispose of something.
That's correct.
And if it's the person who did the shooting who's trying to do that, that person's running around with evidence.
That's correct.
Now, in these studies of particularly serial killers, people who have killed multiple times, where you see, I guess, the highest level of organization and planning.
That's correct, yes.
When people like that are planning crimes, do they plan for these eventualities, like you'll have to get rid of this and you'll have to get rid of that unless you do it this way or unless you do it that way?
Yes.
That's irrelevant.
Overall.
Yes, they do.
So is the fact that you then take evidence and leave it in a place and call the police and bring them to that place a non-planned, non-thought-out type of activity?
Yes, it is.
Now, you're aware in this case, are you not, that it was Erik and Lyle who called the police, the defendants who called the police to the scene?
I am aware of that.
And you're aware, are you not, that prior to ever searching Erik Menendez's car, the police allowed Erik and Lyle Menendez to go to that car and they removed material from it?
I am aware of that.
Does the need to do that bespeak pre-crime planning?
No, it does not.
This is so fascinating.
Is there, strike that, with disorganized crime scenes,
Yes.
is there a pattern to the apprehension of the perpetrators?
Yes, there is.
And what is that pattern?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
With highly disorganized crime scenes and in domestic type crimes, okay?
Yes.
Does the FBI train both their own agents and other law enforcement to look for the perpetrator right there at the scene?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
In this case, were the shooters right there at the scene when the police came?
Yes, they were.
Are disorganized crime scene creators ordinarily caught more quickly than organized crime scene creators?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
Isn't the whole point of this crime scene analysis to assist the police in the swift apprehension of perpetrators?
Yes, it is.
And isn't it also standard investigative practice and taught as part of this crime scene classification that the person who calls in at a scene of a domestic crime is usually the prime suspect?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
Now, you're aware, are you not, Dr. Burgess, that there's evidence in this case that Erik and Lyle Menendez purchased the weapons used some days before the shooting.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Now, is that activity any part of crime scene analysis or crime scene classification?
It may be, yes.
Does the fact that the weapons used in a disorganized crime scene were purchased days before change the analysis that the crime scene was still disorganized with respect to planning to avoid detection?
Objection made.
Rephrase the question.
Okay. Your opinion is that in applying these FBI guidelines of analysis, that this crime scene bespeaks lack of pre-crime planning.
That is correct.
All right. Does the fact that the shotguns that were used were bought 3 days before change that?
No, it does not.
I'm really wondering how this is going to end up on cross-examination. Because of course, it's where the rubber meets the road. I mean, so far I am like eating all of this up, right? This whole, all of these factors for this being an organized versus a disorganized crime scene. It's funny because it's like, it's for me, I have never heard these terms used. I'm sure other people have by now. You know, this is like, it seems new for at this trial. So I'm sure it's been used elsewhere since then. But it's just, it makes perfect sense the way that she's explaining these things. So I'm very curious to see how it's going to happen on cross-examination. You know, how it's going to be picked apart by the prosecution and if that's going to be successful. Anyway, let's continue on.
Okay, now I'm going to change the subject, if I might. After this 15-year project with the FBI, did you engage in other research?
Yes, I did.
Actually, during the same 15 years, you were doing other things as well, were you not?
Yes, I was.
And were you involved in a clinical practice as well as your teaching?
Yes, I was.
And did you, during those same years, publish articles and other writings concerning abused children, sexually molested children, victims of sexual assault?
Yes, I did.
And did that research and the clinical practice, in your clinical practice, you treat sexually abused persons, do you not?
Yes, I do.
Did that lead you to another area of research apart from this crime scene analysis and victimology?
Yes, it did.
And what area of research did that work lead you to?
The area of research led to the understanding of the brain and its functioning. And this came about because in our clinical work, my colleague, Carol Hartman, and I noticed how persistent symptoms were that victims had. And despite our efforts to try to extinguish some of those symptoms, we were not having a great deal of success. And so we looked for information that could help us to better understand it. If we could better understand it, that would give us some ideas of where to point our directions for treatment.
Okay, let me interrupt you for a minute so we can get some definition here of some terms you've used. You said in treating your patients in your clinical practice, these were victims of?
Yes, of crime victims or trauma victims.
Okay. When you talk about trauma victims, do sexually molested children and other abused children fit within that category of trauma victims?
Yes, of course.
Yes, they do.
Do Vietnam War veterans fit within that category of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Do children who have observed wars or violence in the home fit within that category of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Are people who are involved, not just victims of crime, but victims of accidents where they're badly hurt, can they be trauma victims?
Yes, they may be.
All right. And does your practice include people from all those categories of trauma victims?
Yes, they do.
Now, you said there were persistent symptoms. Were these symptoms related to the trauma?
Yes, they were.
And you said you couldn't reach them in therapy. What do you mean by that? What do you mean you couldn't reach these symptoms in therapy?
Using traditional therapy, which is talking therapy, psychotherapy.
you couldn't get rid of the symptoms? Is that what you mean?
Yes, I mean, we could do a lot of talking, but the intrusive thoughts and the images were still very present in the victims, the patients.
That was my next question. What were the symptoms that were proving so resistant to therapy?
The recurring thoughts of what had happened. And it would be both the visual images that they had, it would be wherever from a sensory standpoint, they might see things, they might hear things, they may smell things. They would get a re-experiencing of the traumatic event.
And is this an area that's been subject to a fair amount of research, the fact that traumatized people tend to re-experience aspects of the trauma?
Yes.
Is this something that in fact began as research into what used to be called shell shock and the experience of soldiers in war?
Yes, it is.
All right, so you wanted to get more information to understand why you couldn't help these patients stop having these replays, if you will, of the trauma.
Yes.
And where did you look to get that information?
We began reviewing the information that was available in the latest brain research, the way the mind worked, if you will, the cognitive sciences, the brain research, stress response theory, and information processing theory.
Was there some basic fund of knowledge about why trauma was producing this replay effect?
Yes, there was some basic information on that.
Could you give us some of that information as, I mean, not dumbed down, but simple enough that we can get it without having to spend 3 or 4 hours listening to it, okay?
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
if you could.
Okay. Basically, we identified the area where much of this processing problem occurred.
What do you mean by processing problem?
Okay. Information comes into a person's mind via neurons that are housed in the brain. They're, if you will, like little neural mappings that we have in our brains. And there are neurotransmitters that carry information from one point to another. And this is basically what comprises how people think and organize their thinking.
Okay, so information comes in and it follows some kind of little map for that kind of information?
That's right. There are various areas in the brain, if you will, that get stimulated depending on what kind of information is coming in.
Okay.
And the area that houses, if you will, the most important part of the brain for all of this is what's called the limbic system. And this limbic system is a group of brain regions. There are actually 3 very important parts of this limbic system. I can say what they are if you want.
Well, I'm going to give you the diagram in a few minutes.
Okay.
May I approach, please?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a little bit of further discussion, the lawyers and I and the witness. So we'll give you a break here until 2.
So here they're going to get into some argument back and forth about whether or not she can testify about the limbic system and this kind of like the parts of the brain. And then the judge at the end is going to conclude that, yes, she has met the minimum qualifications to be able to testify about this stuff. So we are going to skip ahead past
2:30.
past the argument and then get to the good stuff again. Okay. Right about here. Okay.
Get into an actual explanation.
Hang on. Sorry. Let me go back just a smidge. So we can make sure that we catch everything.
All the nature of this reaction. Right. Anything else now before we proceed? All right, let's get the juries in. As I indicated, one juror needs to take a break at 3:15 to go to a medical appointment, so that's what will happen. And we're ready to proceed.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, before we get into an actual explanation and going through the diagrams of the brain and the schematic of the brain that's up there, with respect to the limbic system, has the limbic system of the brain been studied for some time as the location of the human body's response to fear-inducing stimulus?
Yes, it has.
And is that the place where a fear stimulus comes in and where a set of reactions begin?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And what has been known in the research? How far back does this particular research on the limbic system as the fear response locus?
The writing goes back to 1929, Walter Buchanan,
Okay.
who
And what was the basic understanding from all the, and there's been research in this over the years as well.
yes, there has been.
It's almost 60 years of research.
Yes.
More than 60 years. And what is the basic understanding, biological working of this part of the brain as the locus for the body's fear response? How does it work?
How does it work? First of all,
Before we do the
Oh,
diagram,
okay.
if you could just give us a general idea of how it works.
okay. In the brain, there are what are called billions of neurons. And the task of these neurons is to transmit information.
Mhm.
The brain also is mapped. It's what's called neural mapping, and so that they can trace how the parts of the brain interact with each other. And these neurons take the information back and forth. In the limbic system is also housed where information comes in. So it's a very, very important part of the brain where information comes in, as well as the center for alarm and protection.
Now, it's that center. Let's say a piece of fear-inducing information comes in, okay?
Yes.
I step off the curb and a truck is coming towards me,
Yes,
right? Now, that information gets processed into this system.
yes,
And this is also the system where my body's going to respond to that truck.
yes.
Okay, what does my body do in response to that truck?
Okay, there are 3 phases. The first is what's called, as the person reacts, is the preparatory phase. And this is where the body is alerted that there is some danger. Maybe you hear that truck coming down the street. And so what starts to activate are the brain hormones, the stress hormones, that are now going to prepare the individual for the second phase, which is where the body now must make a decision as to whether it is going to fight or flee. In other words, are you going to jump back out of the street as that truck comes, or are you going to run across the street to try to get out of its way?
Okay, now before you get to fight or flight,
This is so good. I think that also this testimony was also helped by that objection as to the limbic system and all this kind of stuff, because the jury had a break before coming back in and then launching into this kind of like technical information. So if they, they've had a chance to get up, stretch their legs, kind of walk around, take, maybe have a sip of something. So it's good. For the defense, for them to have had that little bit of a brain break. Culpristic has a good question here. How much are you expecting a jury to absorb when you bring in a witness to this sort of technical information? Sometimes you have a case where you have to get technical about stuff in order to explain something. This is a witness who, in my opinion, is particularly good at explaining this. I was just thinking, this is when it's great to have a university professor who is used to lecture. I mean, not all professors, of course, are actually good at lecturing. Let's be real here. Sometimes their main focus is research or writing papers and having them published, or all kinds of things. So you don't always luck out with a good professor who is actually good at explaining things, but this is one who is very good at explaining things, and it seems that she is very experienced, not just at understanding and researching all of this kind of stuff, but also explaining it to people who otherwise don't know or wouldn't be able to understand this kind of thing. And maybe this comes from her time as a professor. Maybe it comes from her time, working with the FBI, maybe training, police departments and things like that on this kind of stuff. I don't know, but she is we've talked a lot about expert witnesses, how sometimes they can just be really boring. You check out, you don't really hear what they have to say. And then there are some that are particularly engaging. And I think that this is one that is very good at explaining this kind of stuff. So I don't know, but sorry, excuse me. I need to breathe again. let me know if you guys agree. If you're particularly engaged with this testimony right now, or if you kind of feel like maybe the jury's not listening. I don't know. Maybe you have a different perspective. Maybe it's just the subject matter that is particularly interesting to me. But I find this to be pretty compelling and pretty, absorbing, at least enough to understand what's happening.
Like, and I'll give you a different example than a truck for that. But first of all, what are the hormones that the brain releases?
Okay. There are actually two, and it's what's called a kind of biphasic. In other words, two phases. It's the noradrenergic system gets activated.
Okay.
And
the N system.
Yeah. And it has what's called, it inhibits and it activates. So this is the two phases that is now, which speaks to the fight-flight phenomenon. So that you have both of these stress hormones going, and it shows itself also in one's body because it is preparing the body to fight so that the muscles get taut, the heart beats.
Is this what releases adrenaline?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay,
That's one of the stress hormones.
Okay,
yes.
So one of the stress hormones releases adrenaline or activates the adrenal system to release adrenaline?
Right, and it gets activated in the brain, even though people feel it in the rest of their body. The brain is the primary place where it gets activated. And then because these neurons are telling the rest of the body what to do, how to prepare itself to do something.
Okay, and people usually report that there are certain physiological symptoms of terror,
yes,
if you will.
They do.
Rapid heartbeat, for
yes.
example. That's because of adrenaline. That's one of the things that the stress hormones release.
Yes, it's getting more blood, if you will, to the body so that it will be prepared.
Okay, adrenaline stimulates the heart to...
The thing that also is helpful about this is that although it is a very technical explanation of how something happens in the body, everyone has been through a situation like this. Every single juror has been through some kind of fight or flight response at some point in their life, more than likely, at least like, I don't know, 3 dozen times by that point. You know what I mean? So even if you're kind of grasping some of this stuff in a technical kind of way, you can sort of filter it into your past experiences when you felt fight or flight, and what happened in your body, and the adrenaline and the breathing and blood rushing and all of that kind of stuff. You can kind of piece that together with what your past experiences have been. So that's another thing that's helpful with this kind of technical analysis, is that it's very relatable.
The beating creates more blood.
That's right.
Okay. People also talk about a tingling sensation, breathing sensations. Are these things sometimes sweat breaking out on the brow,
yes.
Clamminess, and are these physiological reactions all caused by the release of these stress hormones from this center of the brain?
Yes, and it's all automatic. It's not under anybody's control. This just happens automatically.
Now, you said the first phase is the alarm bells are going off.
Yes.
And all this stuff is flowing.
Yes.
Okay. The second phase now is when the body needs to take action of some kind.
That's correct.
In talking about, and this has been called the fight-flight stage, correct?
That's correct.
And let's talk about it in terms of fight-flight. Let's say somebody is coming at me to attack me, fists are up and
yes.
looks really angry. Now, I've got to decide... my body's got to decide whether to fight him or to run.
That's right.
Okay. Now, what is going on then biologically in this second stage when I'm being faced by this attack?
Well, that's essentially when all of the hormones are spreading to tell the body to pick two of these decisions of what you're going to do, make a decision.
Okay. All right. And how is this decision making made? Now, I mean, is this if the body's with all these alarm bells going on, okay,
mm-hmm.
is the decision to fight or flight a decision that's made in the cognitive part, or is this a decision that's being made from this automatic everything's flowing part?
Well, it generally is automatic because people, again, to use the other analogy, are going to jump back if they see a truck coming.
They're not going to think.
They're not even going to think. Right. They're just going to, because it's instinctual. The fear response is present in the body to protect the person from danger. So survival becomes the main goal, if you will, why this whole system gets activated.
And these reactions, this fight-flight reaction, is instantaneous and automatic?
Yes.
Okay, and now in this particular phase, when the body is sprung into action, either jumping back or running forward, is there another set of hormones that get released, triggered from the limbic system?
Yes. And then there's the third phase.
Okay.
And this is what's called the blunting phase. And now the hormones change to kind of blunt pains. Take, for example, a physical trauma. In other words, people can not even realize that they've had an injury, and they see the next day that their arm is black and blue. And they might even say, how did I get that? Then they will have to think back to how they got it, because the blunting, if you will, the opioid system is activated to protect the person from the pain.
Now, the body releases opiate-type hormones that act upon neurons in such a way, nerve endings, that you don't feel pain.
That's right.
Now, is that the same thing that happens, say, if you're confronted and you're stabbed and you don't feel the wound
That's right.
for a while?
Yes. In fact, trauma victims coming into emergency room very often will describe that quite vividly.
Okay, so we've been through these three stages. The first hormones are the alert system. Then there's the second phase where the body automatically reacts. And
Yes.
then there's the third blunting phase.
That's right.
Now, in this blunting phase, when the opiate system is activated, are there physical symptoms of this as well?
Yes.
And what are the physical symptoms of this?
What happens here is if the danger finally passes, then the body now is in almost an exhausted phase. And if there has been too much stimulation and activation of all of this, I mean, you can ultimately get death from such extended trauma. But essentially, in situations we've just been talking about, the person would feel kind of exhausted. There's a crisis, and all the body reacts, and then they would just feel a lot of exhaustion. And that's the way the body is going to rejuvenate itself, get itself back, if you will, reset itself. The brain's got to reset itself.
Okay. Now, with respect to those things that set off the alarms to begin with, the fear response, okay, is there a terminology for what those things are that set off a fear response?
Extreme danger.
Okay. Are there cues that set off a fear response?
Yeah, anything in the environment that the person feels as a threat is going to set that off.
Now, your research was not this fundamental research into how the limbic system works, because that's been a given in medical biological circles for a long time, correct?
That's correct.
Your research and other more recent research has to do with what? With tying this to what?
Well, applying this to the symptoms that we see in traumatized populations so that we can better assist and help someone who has had a traumatizing experience.
Okay. Now, has it been understood and known in psychological research for some time that people who have been traumatized, who have experienced overwhelming fear over the course of their life, tend to react differently to new threats of fear than people who have not been traumatized by fear?
Yes.
And what is the difference that has been studied from watching and knowing about the behaviors of people?
Okay. What happens when there's been overwhelming fear and it's been repeated very often is that in the brain, there is what's called a genetic recoding. And so the fear level now for that person is going to be at a different level than for someone who has not experienced whatever that fear was.
Before we get to that, let's just talk about a behavioral stand before we get to what the brain is doing. Okay. The recent research shows that there's actually been genetic changes in the brains of overwhelmingly traumatized people.
Yes.
So their brain system will operate automatically in response to new fear cues at a much quicker level than people who have never been subjected to overwhelming fear.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
But before we get to this new research on genetic recoding, was there observable in the behavior of people who had been traumatized, overwhelmed by fear, that they were having fear reactions?
Oh, yes.
Okay. They were having fear reaction based on much lower levels of stimulus than my truck coming down the street.
Yes,
Okay, so a horn could honk and they'd freak out, basically.
that's right. Yes.
Okay, and you have said that you were led into this research because of intrusive thoughts, of flashbacks, of re-experiencing fearful events among trauma victims.
That's correct.
But was there also observed, apart from people having flashbacks or re-experiencing, was there also observed among traumatized people heightened sensitivity to cues of potential fear?
Yes. Yes.
Was there also observed anxiety levels in these people, a sort of high ongoing level of fear?
Yes.
This is so important for the defense. This is so important for the defense, especially if the jury is paying attention here. And I I hope for the defense's sake that they are, because this is going to the fear that the brothers had in the moments immediately leading up to killing their parents. Because anyone who is brand new to the case is likely to look at this and say, really? They really thought that their parents were about to kill them? How is that possible? This puts them in a category that is different from most people because of the chronic trauma, because of the chronic abuse that they had been exposed to for their entire lives, not just including the essay, but the other stuff too. So that includes Lyle in addition to Erik. So this is it's very interesting that a smaller trigger would have caused a fear response, a fight or flight response. So meaning that the thing that made them think it's happening now and grab their shotguns and everything was, someone else might look at it and be like, that's totally unreasonable. How could they possibly have thought that? Previously we had talked about the fact that they hadn't slept in several days. That can have an impact, of course. The fact that they, the fact that they've been abused, and whatnot. But this gives a very, very technical answer as to how that could happen, because literally the brain recodes itself according to the research because of the fact that they had been through this chronic traumatization, chronic abuse and everything else, like that for their entire lives. It's such an incredible explanation for the defense, so long as the jury is listening.
You're familiar with the research on abused children that talks about such things as hypervigilance.
Yes, I am.
What does hypervigilance have to do with this discussion about fear and reaction to fear?
In essence, that observation is explained by this fear-altered process. In other words, something in the environment is causing that the person is constantly searching the environment for anything that may be dangerous.
And that seems to be a common characteristic of people who have been traumatized by fear-inducing behaviors.
Yes, it is.
With
That makes
abused
sense.
children, for example, or battered wives, for example, people who have been physically or psychologically or sexually assaulted,
Yes.
do they develop patterns of hypervigilance, minute watching of the behaviors of the people who have assaulted them or battered them?
Yes, they do.
And do they appear as a group to have this generalized high level of anxiety?
Yes, they do.
And has there been a great deal of research on how easily thrown into high levels of fear they are by the slightest changes or cues in the behavior of their batterers?
Yes, in that type of situation, yes.
Now, the latest research that you were talking about, this genetic recoding, okay? How does this research connect to this behavioral, psychological body of research that's existed for some time?
Okay. Well, the genetic recoding now explains why the person is at a higher level of fear and must survey their environment in this heightened way.
Is there a notion that's come from this, strike that, is it now believed that people who experience these fear-inducing traumas that their brain actually repatterns?
Yes, it gets rewired, repatterned. That's, yes.
And is there a term, rekindling, that is associated with this research?
Yes, there is.
And would you explain to us what the rekindling term means?
Rekindling essentially means that as the new people have not been traumatized at one level. People who have been traumatized, it takes much less to activate their fear response. And literally, it's a term. Rekindling means that there already is a base there for the fear to be activated. And so it just takes much less or more subtle kinds of cues in the environment to activate their fear response.
From an evolutionary perspective, it kind of makes sense. You know, the fact that human beings are very adaptable to different kinds of environments. If your environment is suddenly one that is incredibly dangerous and, you know, you are constantly uh under some sort of a threat, it makes sense for your brain to rewire itself for your survival so that you can survive in that environment, so that you know whatever thing in your environment that you have to respond to in order to make it to another day. It makes sense. I had never considered that could happen or would happen, but as she's explaining it, it's like light bulb moment. It makes perfect sense.
I think it's 3:15, Your Honor.
All right, we do have a situation where one of the jurors has an emergency medical appointment to attend to, so we'll accommodate that and recess for the day and for the week. And before I let you go, ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you of
Don't talk about the case. Don't form any final opinions. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. Yes, we got it. All right, you guys. This has been such an interesting session today. Such an interesting episode that we're going to cut it off there as well. Indy is obviously exhausted from all of this, you know, lesson in psychology. I mean, hang on a second. This is deserving of a close up. Oh my goodness. Indy, you were such a little cutie. Alrighty. So, okay. That for me does it. This has been, like I said, so fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me for this and continuing on this road down the Menendez Brothers path. Oh, and we also have a little sleepy kitty that's just waking up from a little nap. Or is she waking up? I don't know. Maybe she's just gonna. Oh yeah, you're just gonna snooze. Just gonna snooze-a-roo. It's okay. She'll have her zoomies later. So anyway, yes, so great, so great. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for engaging in the chat or in the comments. So, you know, whether you are watching live or on replay, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, as always, to the mods for, oh my gosh. Thank you so much to the mods for always helping to make sure that everybody is agreeing and disagreeing in all kinds of ways, but in all ways that are respectful. So anyhow, oh my gosh. Yeah, you are super sleepy right now, huh? And we're gonna have some more content coming out. In case you guys didn't know, I'm sure you probably did hear, Alec Baldwin has been indicted for the death of Lena Hutchins. So for sure, I'm gonna have a video out on that one, and probably some other stuff too. I've got some other stuff that I've been thinking about and looking at and whatnot that I think will be interesting videos. So expect some stuff to come out this week. And of course, to all of the members of Bite Club, that's a yawn. For all the members of Bite Club, we of course will have a Friday members only live stream as usual. So that'll be 10 a.m. East Coast time. So be sure to join us for that. And yeah, that's about that's about it. Oh, now you're waking up to eat my hair, aren't you? Okay. Alrighty, guys. With that, I guess that's about it. That's all I needed to say, huh? Okay. All right. I'll see you guys in the next video.